There is a light that falls only once each day across the limestone ridges of the southern Balkans, a light that seems to wash over stone rather than illuminate it, turning white villages into soft shapes against the darkening sky. Imagine, if you will, the evening hour when the sun has dropped behind the western peaks and the shadows of church spires stretch long across cobbled squares. The wind moves through these ancient places with a particular rhythm, carrying the scent of pine and the faint memory of wood smoke from cooking fires that have burned in the same hearths for centuries. Above the villages, bells toll, the deep bronze voice of Orthodox churches and the lighter silver of Catholic chapels, each calling out across the valleys in their own register, marking time as they have marked time for centuries. In April of 1941, this landscape, this world of stone and bell sound and mountain wind, was about to be shattered by the arrival of mechanized warfare. But for now, in the moment we are approaching, the Balkans existed in a strange suspension. The people who lived in these villages and mountain valleys, who tended vineyards on slopes that fell away into mist, who gathered in town squares to conduct business and gossip and the ordinary rhythms of daily life, did not yet know that within hours their world would transform entirely. They did not yet know what was coming down from Austria and Hungary, the columns of tanks, the roar of aircraft, the occupation that would reshape the region for the next 4 years. What makes this moment worth lingering in, at least briefly, is the profound contrast between the quietness of that evening landscape and the violence that was about to unfold there. This is a history of the Waffen-SS in the Balkans during the Second World War, a story of occupation, resistance, ideology, and survival set against the backdrop of those karst mountains and stone villages we have just imagined. It is a story that involves some of the most difficult chapters of the war, the recruitment of local peoples into SS formations, the doctrine of collective reprisal, the rise of partisan movements, the tension between competing visions of what the Balkans should become. If you find yourself drawn to understanding this particular corner of the Second World War in depth, the complicated interplay of German occupation policy, local collaboration and resistance, the way ordinary people navigated impossible choices in an extraordinary time, then I'd invite you to subscribe for future journeys through the quieter, more detailed corners of Balkan history and WW2. These are stories that deserve to be told slowly and with care. Now, to understand what happened in those mountains and valleys, we must first understand what existed there before the invasion arrived. The Balkans in 1941 were not a unified place, despite the existence of the Kingdom of Yugoslavia. They were, in fact, a deeply fractured mosaic of different peoples, religions, languages, and historical memories. If you were to walk through the region in the spring of 1941, you would move through territories where Serbian Orthodox tradition held deep roots, where Catholic Croats had their own distinct identity and aspiration, where Muslims lived in significant numbers, where Slovenes in the north maintained their own cultural space, where smaller populations of Hungarians, Romanians, Bulgarians, and others wove through the larger tapestry. Each of these communities carried its own sense of historical grievance, its own narrative about the proper order of things, its own ideas about who should govern and who should serve. The Kingdom of Yugoslavia itself, established only a few decades earlier after the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, was held together by what we might call a fragile consensus. The Serbian political and military establishment, which had emerged from the Balkan Wars and the First World War with considerable prestige, held disproportionate power in the federal structure, but this arrangement satisfied neither those who wanted greater Serbian dominance nor those who resented Serbian dominance and dreamed of their own independent states. Croats, in particular, felt historically disadvantaged. They had been part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and considered themselves more Central European in character than the primarily Orthodox Serbian core. There were Croatians who dreamed of breaking away, of establishing their own independent state with its own government and its own destiny. These tensions existed beneath the surface of Yugoslav life in 1941, sometimes openly acknowledged, sometimes carefully masked by official pronouncements about unity and brotherhood. The government in Belgrade attempted to maintain some form of national cohesion, but the monarchy, under King Peter II, though effective power rested with the regent Prince Paul, was navigating extraordinarily difficult circumstances. Europe was being remade by Nazi Germany, and Yugoslavia found itself squeezed between the ambitions of Rome and Berlin on one side, and the uncertain friendship of Western powers on the other. Prince Paul attempted a strategy of cautious diplomatic maneuvering, hoping to preserve Yugoslav independence through careful balance and strategic neutrality. Whether such an approach could have succeeded indefinitely remains one of those unanswerable historical questions we sometimes wonder about in the darkness. The terrain itself, those very karst mountains and valleys we imagined at the beginning, was part of what made the Balkans such a strategically challenging region. This was not flat, easily controlled territory. It was broken country, high plateaus cut by gorges, villages reachable only by mountain passes, dense forests providing natural concealment, stone villages built with solid walls that could serve as defensive positions if necessary. In normal times, this terrain made unified governance difficult. In times of war and occupation, it would become something else entirely. It would become the canvas upon which resistance movements could operate, upon which occupiers would struggle to extend effective control, upon which the drama of the war years would unfold in ways that neither the German High Command nor the Yugoslav government could have fully predicted. There was also the question of natural resources. The Balkans held strategic materials that Nazi Germany desperately needed: chrome from Yugoslavia, bauxite, copper, and agricultural products from the broader region. Control of the Balkans meant access to these materials, and it also meant securing the southern flank of the German sphere while maintaining a buffer against any potential threat from the Mediterranean. This was not sentimental territory for Berlin. It was territory with concrete economic and military value. The administrative structures that governed the Balkans in 1941 were, in many cases, remnants of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, adapted or reformed in the 2 decades since Yugoslav unification. There were local authorities in the villages, regional governors, a civil service that attempted to function across the various ethnic and religious lines that divided the population. Some of these officials were competent and reasonably honest. Others were corrupt or had little real authority beyond their immediate office. When the invasion came, this entire administrative apparatus would either be preserved, restructured, or dismantled, depending on how the Germans and their Axis allies chose to organize occupied territories. Understanding this landscape of governance and ethnic division is essential to understanding what happened next. One more element worth considering as we approach the moment of invasion: the strategic positioning of powers around Yugoslavia in early 1941. Germany had already occupied Austria and Czechoslovakia. Italy, under Mussolini, had ambitions in the Mediterranean and the Balkans, and harbored designs on Yugoslav territory, particularly in the Adriatic. Hungary, closely aligned with Germany, hoped to reclaim territories it had lost after the First World War. Bulgaria, traditionally ambitious in Macedonia and Thrace, also eyed Balkan territory. The Soviet Union, despite its non-aggression pact with Germany, remained a potential threat from the north. Britain and the United States were distant powers for now, concerned but unable to offer direct military support to Yugoslavia. The stage was set for a collision. So in that golden hour of April 1941, as the sun descended toward the western peaks and the church bells called across the valleys, the people in those stone villages inhabited a world that was about to cease existing. Not destroyed, not entirely, but transformed utterly. The occupation that followed would bring new authorities, new ideologies, new forms of control and violence. It would create spaces for both collaboration and resistance. It would challenge ordinary people to make impossible choices about loyalty, survival, and conscience. And it would scatter the attention of history across the mountains and valleys, focusing sometimes on the actions of grand strategic actors, sometimes on the experiences of people simply trying to endure until the chaos ended and some new order emerged. The bells tolled that evening as they had tolled for centuries. They would continue to toll through the occupation years to come, even as the landscape around them transformed in ways profound and terrible. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. The invasion itself has not yet occurred. Let us, for now, hold ourselves in this moment of dusk, in this stillness before the storm, breathing in the wind that moves through the karst country and listening to the distant sound of bells marking time. The wind carries the memory of centuries across these valleys, and the stories held within them are intricate, layered, and often overlooked in the broader sweep of the Second World War. This corner of Europe, where mountains meet plains, where orthodox crosses stand beside minarets, where languages shift and blend, witnessed occupation, resistance, collaboration, and courage in forms distinct from what unfolded across the rest of the continent. To truly understand what happened in the Balkans during those 5 years of conflict requires patience, requires sitting with complexity, requires allowing oneself to be drawn into the lived experience of people caught between competing ideologies and armies, all while trying to simply survive. If the stories of ordinary people enduring extraordinary circumstances interest you, if you find yourself wanting to move deeper into these corners of history that are sometimes whispered about, but rarely fully illuminated, then you might consider subscribing to our journey through this particular landscape. We're creating a series of extended, unhurried narratives tracing the Waffen-SS and its operations across these Balkan territories, examining not in broad strokes, but in careful detail, the occupation, the resistance movements that rose to meet it, the civilians whose lives were transformed by forces beyond their control, and the long aftermath of memory and reconciliation that continues to shape these lands today. Each episode moves slowly, allowing the historical currents to emerge naturally, connecting personal testimony with documented records, weaving together the perspectives of soldiers, partisans, occupiers, and those who simply endured in villages whose names are now markers on a map of suffering and survival. What makes this region's story particularly worth exploring, if you are drawn to understanding how power operates, how communities fragment and reform, how ideology encounters reality on the ground, is precisely that it defies simple narration. The Balkans during the German occupation present us not with a single occupation story, but with multiple overlapping narratives, some tragic, some inspiring, all of them inseparable from the terrain itself, from the memory embedded in stone and soil. By subscribing, you're choosing to sit with these complexities over time, to absorb not just facts, but the texture of what these years meant for those who lived through them, and to understand how a region comes to terms with such profound rupture. We continue these explorations slowly, deliberately, with each episode building a deeper sense of place and time. There is no rush. History, after all, is best understood not in hurried summary, but in sustained attention, in the willingness to linger with difficult truths and human stories until they become, in their own way, luminous. And so we return to the eve of that invasion, to the moment before everything changed, to Yugoslavia as it existed in those final months of peace, a kingdom of profound internal tensions, a mosaic of competing nationalisms, religions, and territorial claims, all held together by a fragile political arrangement that few believed would survive intact. The mountains stood as they always had, the villages continued their rhythms of work and worship, and in Belgrade, in Zagreb, in the administrative centers of power, men who understood the currents of European geopolitics read the signs with growing alarm. War was coming. It was not a question of if, but when, and what form it would take when it arrived. If you were to stand in the highlands of Yugoslavia in the spring of 1941, you would have felt the weight of a region poised between worlds. The kingdom stretched across nearly 180,000 square miles of some of Europe's most intricate terrain, a landscape of deep valleys and mountain barriers that had preserved across centuries not one coherent nation, but rather a delicate, fragile assembly of distinct peoples. To understand what was about to unfold would require holding in mind all at once the competing histories, faiths, and ambitions that occupied the same earth. The Kingdom of Yugoslavia itself was a relatively young invention, only 20 years old by 1941, stitched together after the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire following the Great War. Its official formation in 1918 had promised a unified South Slavic state, but unity, one might reflect, was a word that meant something different to each person who spoke it. At the heart of this kingdom lived Serbs, who comprised roughly 45% of the population, and who, through their Orthodox Christian tradition and their memory of medieval kingdoms, possessed a deep sense of historical identity. They occupied the central and eastern regions, particularly Serbia proper, where Belgrade sat as the capital and cultural weight. Yet if the Serbs were the plurality, they were far from a majority that could govern alone. Croatians, who made up roughly 20% of the population, lived primarily in the northwestern regions, in the lands that had once belonged to the Austro-Hungarian crown, territories that bore the architectural and cultural imprint of Vienna and Rome rather than Constantinople. The Croatians followed Roman Catholicism, and their historical experience had been shaped by centuries under Habsburg rule, a very different trajectory than that of the Serbs. These two peoples, while both Slavic in origin, had developed separate identities, separate allegiances, and separate visions of what a unified Yugoslavia should become. Scattered across the landscape were Bosnian Muslims, perhaps another 10% of the population, whose presence reflected centuries of Ottoman occupation, creating a religious and cultural layer that did not fit neatly into either the Serbian Orthodox or Croatian Catholic categories. Alongside them lived Slovenes in the far north, Greeks and Albanians in the southern reaches, Hungarians in the Pannonian plains, and the Volksdeutsche, ethnic Germans who had lived in the region for generations, particularly in the Banat and Swabia regions. This tapestry was further complicated by the presence of Gypsies, Jews, and other minority communities who added still more threads to an already complex weave. The terrain itself seemed to mirror this fragmentation. The Dinaric Alps ran like a spine down the center of the country, creating natural barriers between regions and fostering a kind of geographical isolation. High plateaus alternated with deep river valleys. The coast, where it existed, was rugged and dramatic, with limestone cliffs descending toward the Adriatic. In the north, the landscape flattened into the Pannonian plains. This wasn't a country where movement was easy or communication automatic. It was a land where mountains and forests could swallow armies, where villages could remain isolated from one another across mere dozens of miles, where the very geography seemed to encourage separation rather than unity. Politically, the interwar period had been marked by what many historians describe as chronic instability. The centralized government in Belgrade, dominated by Serbian leadership, had frequently clashed with Croatian and Slovenian politicians who felt their interests were being subordinated to Serbian nationalist ambitions. The Croatian Peasant Party, representing rural Catholic interests, had been in conflict with the Serbian-dominated regime repeatedly through the 1920s and 1930s. There had even been assassinations, most notably that of Croatian deputy Stjepan Radić, in the parliament itself in 1928, a moment that had sent shockwaves through the fragile polity and deepened the ethnic divisions. By 1941, King Peter II was officially the monarch, though he was only 16 years old, and power rested in the hands of Regent Prince Paul, who attempted to navigate the treacherous waters of European diplomacy in an era when neutrality was becoming increasingly impossible. The country had tried to maintain a delicate balance, appealing to neither the Axis nor the Allies too openly, but such balance was becoming ever more precarious. Economic pressures, the rise of Nazi Germany across the northern borders, and Mussolini's Italy controlling the Adriatic approaches, left little room for genuine independence. Within Yugoslavia itself, various political movements had emerged to compete for power and vision. There were royalist officers who believed in a strong, centralized Serbian-dominated state. There were Croatian separatists who saw an independent Croatian nation as their destiny. There were ultranationalist movements and, increasingly, there were communists, particularly Serbian communists, gathered around a man named Josip Broz, known by his underground alias Tito, who had spent years building a revolutionary organization in the shadows of Yugoslav society, waiting for the moment when circumstances might allow them to emerge. The economic situation across the country was difficult, even before war arrived. Agricultural regions struggled with limited markets. Industrial capacity was concentrated in a few centers. Unemployment was significant. The class tensions that had marked the wider European experience during the Great Depression had not bypassed Yugoslavia. Workers' movements, peasant grievances, and intellectual ferment all swirled beneath the surface of official political discourse. Religious affiliations, one should note, were often inseparable from ethnic and national identity in this region, in a way that differed from Western Europe. Being Serbian meant belonging to the Serbian Orthodox Church, with all its historical and cultural implications. Being Croatian meant the Catholic faith and a particular orientation towards Central Europe. Being Bosnian Muslim meant inheriting a complicated history of imperial overlordship and cultural persistence. These weren't merely personal spiritual choices. They were markers of group identity, sources of political loyalty, and windows into competing historical narratives about who had the right to govern these lands and how. By spring of 1941, there was a pervasive sense, among those who could read the international situation, that Yugoslavia's carefully maintained neutrality was unsustainable. Hitler's ambitions were expanding relentlessly. Germany had absorbed Austria, had conquered much of Eastern Europe, and now was turning its gaze toward the Balkans and toward Greece, where Italian forces under Mussolini had already been engaged without conspicuous success. The question was not whether invasion would come, but when, and what would happen to this intricate mosaic of peoples when the machinery of modern industrial warfare descended upon these ancient mountains and valleys. The Balkans in 1941 were, in essence, a region of profound contradictions, unified in name yet fractured in reality, ancient in culture yet young as a nation-state, positioned between empires and ideologies, inhabited by peoples with deep historical grievances against one another, and caught in the path of forces far larger than themselves. It was into this landscape, already marked by internal tensions and external pressures, that the armies of Nazi Germany were about to arrive. On April 6th, the bombers came. They fell upon Belgrade in waves, and the city's anti-aircraft defenses, such as they were, proved almost useless against the Luftwaffe's dominance of the skies. This was not a gradual mobilization, or a distant thunder of artillery working its way closer over weeks. This was sudden, overwhelming force applied with the precision of industrial killing. The bombing was followed almost immediately by ground invasion from multiple directions. German columns from Austria and Hungary, Italian forces from the west and south, and Hungarian and Bulgarian contingents pressing in from their respective borders. The geography of invasion was calculated to prevent any unified Yugoslav response, to strike from every direction at once and render coordination impossible. The Yugoslav army, numerically substantial on paper, more than 1 million men in full mobilization, crumbled with a speed that surprised even the German high command. Why did this happen so swiftly? Several factors converged like converging rivers into a single catastrophic flood. The military leadership was aging, their tactics rooted in the First World War, and the assumption that defensive positions and fortified lines would matter in modern warfare. The officer corps was itself fragmented along ethnic lines, Serbs holding the highest ranks and Croats and Slovenes harboring deep resentments at what they perceived as Serbian dominance. When the invasion came, this internal fracture became fatal. Some units fought with desperate bravery, particularly in the rugged terrain where the land itself seemed to offer promise of resistance, but they fought in isolation, unable to communicate with neighboring commands, cut off by the rapid German breakthrough. Within days, columns of tanks and motorized infantry had penetrated far into the interior, sowing panic and disorganization. The assumption that the Balkans would tie down German forces for months that the mountainous terrain would be an ally to defenders, proved fundamentally wrong against an opponent possessing air superiority, motorized mobility, and the momentum of previous victories. Greece fell even faster than Yugoslavia, a matter of astonishment even to observers in Berlin. The British had dispatched forces to support the Greek resistance, but these expeditionary troops, hastily assembled and inadequately equipped, were swept aside in a matter of days. Greece had been fighting Italy since October 1940, and its army was already exhausted, its resources depleted, its soldiers weary beyond measure. When the German invasion came from the north, descending through Yugoslavia and Bulgaria, with what seemed like supernatural speed, the Greek forces simply could not mount an effective defense. Within 3 weeks, the Wehrmacht had driven down to the sea, captured Athens, and forced the evacuation of British forces in a scramble that recalled Dunkirk's chaos. By late April, both Yugoslavia and Greece lay under Axis occupation, and the swiftness of the victory seemed to confirm to many observers that the Nazis were indeed unstoppable, that their military machine had achieved a level of perfection that no conventional resistance could check. But what happened next tells a different, more complicated story. The swift military victory was one thing. The partition and consolidation of occupied territory was quite another, and here, the unity of the invasion began to reveal its fundamental weaknesses. There was no single occupier, no unified plan for what would happen once the fighting stopped. Instead, the territory of Yugoslavia and Greece was carved up among competing powers, according to a logic that was strategic, ideological, and often contradictory. The Germans retained direct control of certain regions deemed strategically important or economically valuable, the iron and copper mines of Serbia, for instance, and the agricultural lands of Slavonia, but they could not occupy and garrison everything themselves. The Italian army held significant territory, particularly along the Dalmatian coast and parts of Greece, areas that Mussolini had long coveted. Hungary was granted regions of northern Yugoslavia as a reward for its cooperation in the invasion and as an inducement to continued loyalty. Bulgaria received Macedonia and portions of eastern Serbia, fulfilling old nationalist ambitions. And then there was the bizarre arrangement for Croatia, soon to be formalized as the independent state of Croatia, a puppet regime that would prove to be one of the most unsettling chapters in the entire occupation. The partition was not made according to any coherent principle of administration or even military logic. Rather, it reflected the competing territorial claims and feuds of the Axis powers themselves, each advancing its own interests and legacy of historical grievance. This created a landscape of overlapping jurisdictions, conflicting orders, and fundamental confusion about who had the actual authority to make decisions on the ground. A German SS officer in a Bosnian town might find himself negotiating with Italian administrators, Croatian Ustaše militia, Hungarian soldiers, and local Serbian collaborators, all pursuing their own agendas, all certain that their mission took precedence. This fragmented occupation structure would have consequences that rippled outward across the years to come, creating spaces where resistance could grow and flourish, divisions that insurgents could exploit, and a sense of arbitrariness that bred both desperation and defiance among the occupied population. What is worth noting as we approach the stranger territories of this history is that the speed of the military collapse had a psychological dimension that extended far beyond the battlefield. For the first time, the Germans had conquered a region with a substantial Balkan population, Serbs, Croats, Slovenes, Bosnians, and others, peoples whose relationship to European civilization, nationalism, and ethnic identity was intensely complicated, rooted in centuries of religious conflict, imperial overlordship, and competing visions of belonging. The swift collapse of the Yugoslav state released forces that had been held in check by an admittedly weak central authority. And now, in the vacuum left by invasion and occupation, those tensions would begin to express themselves in ways that would ultimately define the entire occupational experience and create possibilities for both collaboration and resistance that neither the Germans nor their local partners had fully anticipated or controlled. Within days of Yugoslavia's collapse, the map of the Balkans was redrawn with a pen that moved almost as swiftly as the German tanks had rolled across the landscape. Territory was carved up among the victors, some to Italy, some directly administered by Germany itself, some handed to Hungary and Bulgaria as rewards for their allegiance. But there was one creation that stood apart, a state conjured almost from nothing, assembled from the spoils like a puzzle designed to serve a very particular purpose. This was the independent state of Croatia, the NDH as it came to be known, and it would become one of the strangest and most troubling instruments of occupation in all of occupied Europe. The man chosen to lead this new state was Ante Pavelić, a Croatian nationalist whose political career had been forged in exile, in Hungarian safe houses and Italian cities, nursing grievances that stretched back decades. Pavelić had spent years plotting the independence of Croatia from the Serbian-dominated Yugoslav kingdom, imagining a future in which Croats would control their own destiny. When the Germans invaded, his moment arrived with almost too much symmetry to seem real. The Wehrmacht did not choose Pavelić because they loved Croatian nationalism. Rather, they installed him because a puppet state required a puppet ruler, someone who would be grateful for the throne upon which he sat and obliged to do the occupier's bidding. Pavelić was that man, and he brought with him an ideology that had been developing in the émigré communities of Central Europe, an ideology called Ustasha. The Ustasha movement was ultra-nationalist, clerical, and deeply rooted in notions of racial and religious exclusivity. It drew upon a particular reading of Croatian history, one that emphasized the ancient and separate nature of the Croatian people, their Catholic faith as a defining characteristic that set them apart, and their right to dominion over the territories they inhabited. But embedded within this nationalism was something darker still, a vision of the state, purified of those who did not belong, who threatened its integrity, who could not be assimilated into the new order. In this vision, Serbs were ancient enemies, orthodox in faith, and thus doubly foreign in a Catholic nation. Jews were international conspirators and economic parasites. Roma and other minorities were simply undesirable. This ideology was not invented in Zagreb. It drew heavily from currents already running through European fascism, particularly Italian fascism and German racial thinking. Yet in the Croatian context, it took on a particular character, rooted in local grievances, religious divisions, and the specific history of conflict between Serbs and Croats. When Pavelić's government took power in April 1941, it moved with striking efficiency to consolidate that power and to implement its vision. Laws were passed quickly, racial laws modeled loosely on those already in effect in Germany, though adapted to Croatian circumstances. Serbian cultural organizations were banned, Serbian language was restricted in public life. But the Ustasha did not content itself with legal restrictions and bureaucratic oppression. From the very beginning, there was a paramilitary dimension, a violence that seemed to operate according to its own logic, driven by ideological fervor rather than military necessity. Ustasha units, many of them young men who had grown up in the nationalist fervor of the interwar years, began to carry out pogroms against Serbian civilians. In some towns, this violence was sudden and shocking. In others, it unfolded more gradually, a slow strangulation of Serbian life and livelihood. The relationship between Pavelić's government and its German overlords was always complex, and this complexity would define much of what happened in Croatia during the occupation years. The Germans wanted order, security, and reliable extraction of resources. They wanted a stable rear area that would not require constant military intervention. They wanted the state of Croatia to police itself, to control its own population, and to suppress any resistance before it could spread. In this sense, the Germans supported the Ustasha's repressive apparatus, or at least did not actively interfere with it. Yet there were tensions beneath the surface, disagreements about means and degree, about how harshly the occupation should be implemented, about who should have ultimate authority in disputed matters. Some within the German occupation apparatus, particularly those in the SS, with their racial ideology and their vision of racial reorganization, found much to admire in the Ustascha's extremism. The SS would eventually come to see Croatia as a place where their own racial vision might be tested and implemented on a significant scale. Others within the German military administration found the Ustascha's violence excessive and counterproductive, fearing that it would drive the population into the arms of resistance movements. The Wehrmacht officers, many of them of an older generation with professional military traditions, sometimes viewed the Ustascha with distaste, seeing them as undisciplined thugs rather than soldiers. These tensions never quite exploded into open conflict. The Germans held ultimate power and could have restrained the Ustascha if they had truly wished to do so, but they created a kind of fractured occupation in which different German agencies pursued different goals, and the Ustascha operated with a degree of autonomy that was unusual in the occupied territories. The resources of the Croatian state were placed at the disposal of the German war effort. Grain and livestock were requisitioned. Factories were converted to production for the Wehrmacht. Young men were conscripted into military service, some into the Croatian armed forces and some into German units, including eventually the Waffen-SS. But the Croatian government also served another purpose for its German sponsors. It provided a kind of ideological legitimacy to the occupation itself, the appearance of local collaboration and consent. The Ustascha could claim that they were leading an independent nation, that they were partners rather than merely occupied territory, that the harsh policies being implemented were Croatian decisions made by Croatian leaders for Croatian reasons. This fiction was important because it disguised the reality of German control and made the occupation seem less like raw conquest and more like a negotiated alliance. Yet beneath these official relationships, beneath the German-Croatian agreements and the shared ideology of nationalism and racial exclusivity, there lay a fundamental inequality that could never quite be overcome. The Croats had their state, such as it was, only because Germany permitted it. Pavelić had his throne only as long as Berlin said he could keep it. If the Germans had decided to withdraw their support, if they had chosen to directly administer Croatia as they did Serbia or Greece, there was nothing Pavelić could have done to prevent it. This knowledge shaped every interaction between the two governments, every negotiation, every compromise. The Ustascha operated with a certain autonomy in matters of internal policy. They could decide how harshly to treat Serbian civilians, how aggressively to implement their racial laws. But on matters of military importance, on questions of resource extraction and strategic priorities, the Germans remained supreme. The independent state of Croatia was independent only in the narrowest sense. In all that truly mattered, it answered to Berlin. To understand the machinery of occupation that would descend upon the Balkans, one must first understand the peculiar institution that the Waffen-SS had become by 1941. For it was neither quite a military force nor quite a police apparatus, but something more unsettling still, an organization that had evolved far beyond its origins as a small ideological bodyguard corps into something that claimed legitimacy as both a military and a quasi-state within the state. In the beginning, in the late 1920s, the SS had been nothing more than Adolf Hitler's personal protection detail, a few dozen men in black uniforms tasked with ensuring his safety at party rallies and political gatherings. But under the leadership of Heinrich Himmler, who took control in 1929, this modest security detail underwent a profound and deliberate transformation. Himmler possessed a particular vision, one rooted in elaborate pseudo-racial ideology, in a kind of mystical romanticism about Germanic virtue and racial purity that drew from nationalist folklore, pseudo-scientific racial theory, and a deeply hierarchical understanding of human society. He set about building the SS into something that resembled in his imagination a modern knightly order, complete with rituals, genealogical examinations, and a rigid code of conduct that its members were expected to embody. The SS that emerged from this process was organized into two distinct but overlapping arms. The first was the Allgemeine SS, the General SS, which served primarily as an administrative and police apparatus, controlling the vast machinery of racial persecution, concentration camps, and internal security. The second was the Waffen-SS, literally the armed SS, which began to take its military form in the mid-1930s as the rearmament of Germany accelerated, and as it became clear that territorial expansion might soon require armed force beyond what the traditional German army, the Wehrmacht, could provide or would be willing to undertake. What made the Waffen-SS distinct from conventional military forces was precisely this ideological foundation. Regular soldiers in most armies are trained to follow orders according to military law and convention, but Waffen-SS recruits, particularly in the earliest formations, were subjected to intense indoctrination in Nazi racial ideology. Officers were selected not merely for military competence, but for their commitment to the ideological worldview that the organization represented. There was something almost theological about the intensity with which this ideology was inculcated. The enemy was not merely a military opponent, but a racial and civilizational threat. Surrender in some circumstances was treated as almost unthinkable. Mercy towards certain categories of enemy was not merely discouraged but actively trained against. Yet there remained a practical tension at the heart of this institution. The Nazi regime needed soldiers, real military formations that could fight effectively against Germany's enemies. The Wehrmacht, the regular German army, was jealous of its military prerogatives and deeply suspicious of what it regarded as the SS's ideological fanaticism and lack of proper military discipline. For much of the 1930s, the Waffen-SS remained small, perhaps 30,000 men by 1939, and was viewed by many senior Wehrmacht officers as an undisciplined political militia masquerading as a military force. But war changes calculations. As Germany expanded its military operations and occupied ever more territory, the need for occupation forces, for security troops, for men willing to carry out the brutal policies that Nazi ideology demanded, grew correspondingly vast. And this is where the Waffen-SS underwent its most consequential transformation. What had begun as a relatively small, ideologically pure organization committed to racial selection, admission required proof of Germanic ancestry back to 1800, began to evolve into something far larger and far more pragmatic. The invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941 marked a turning point. Faced with enormous casualties and the need to maintain occupation forces across an increasingly vast territory, the SS began to relax its strict racial and ideological requirements. Ethnic Germans living outside Germany's borders, Volksdeutsche as they were termed, were increasingly recruited. Then came Scandinavian volunteers, men from Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, who were recruited with nationalist and anti-communist appeals. These could still be framed within an ideological worldview that privileged Germanic peoples, though the racial purity standards were considerably bent. But the process would go further still, as the demands of occupation multiplied, as partisan uprisings emerged in newly conquered territories, and as the manpower requirements of the regime became ever more acute. The SS began recruiting soldiers from among the peoples it had conquered or claimed as ethnic allies. Ukrainians, Latvians, Estonians, Croatians, Muslims from Bosnia, all would eventually find themselves in Waffen-SS formations, often under the guise of volunteer service, sometimes through outright conscription, but increasingly as the war progressed and the ideology proved flexible enough to accommodate practical necessity. This evolution was not without its tensions and contradictions. Purist ideologues within the SS viewed the admission of non-Germanic peoples as a betrayal of the organization's foundational racial mission. Yet pragmatists within the leadership, men like Gottlob Berger who oversaw much of the SS recruitment, argued that the organization's true purpose was to serve the state, to carry out the will of the regime, and that racial purity, while admirable as an ideal, could not be allowed to impede military necessity. The Waffen-SS, they reasoned, could still serve as an ideological vanguard, as the bearer of Nazi values, even if its ranks had been swollen with recruits from conquered lands. What is perhaps most striking, when one considers this institutional evolution, is how readily ideology bent to accommodate material necessity, and how organizations that claimed to stand for timeless principles proved remarkably adaptable when circumstances demanded. The Waffen-SS became, by the middle years of the war, a kind of military melting pot, not in any positive sense, but rather as a desperate assembly of men drawn from across occupied Europe, bound together by military discipline, Nazi ideology in varying degrees of intensity, and often by circumstances that left them little real choice in the matter. And it was precisely this transformed Waffen-SS, multinational, pragmatic, yet still carrying with it the ideological intensity and brutality that characterized the organization at its core, that would arrive in the Balkans in 1941 and beyond, ready to implement the occupation policies that had been devised by Berlin, ready to fight the insurgencies that would emerge against German and Axis rule, ready to carry out the security operations that would leave deep scars across the region for generations to come. When the German army crossed into Yugoslavia in April of 1941, the Waffen-SS was not initially deployed as a fighting force in great numbers. Instead, they arrived in smaller contingents, moving through the chaos of rapid military collapse, with a different purpose altogether. These early detachments operated as liaison officers, intelligence gatherers, and what one might call security advisors, men in crisp uniforms moving between Wehrmacht headquarters and newly established occupation authorities, speaking quietly with the local administrators who were themselves still learning the contours of their new power. The Balkans, you see, were not Berlin or Paris. They were mountainous, linguistically fractured, ethnically layered, in ways that made simple governance a persistent puzzle. The SS recognized this almost immediately. Their role in those first months was less about direct military action and more about observation, assessment, and the careful construction of information networks. They watched the terrain, they studied the people, they reported upward through channels that extended all the way to Berlin, where planners were beginning to imagine what a long occupation might require. In the territory of Serbia, now nominally under German military administration, with a puppet government forming around General Milan Nedic, SS officers began establishing what they called security arrangements. The word itself, security, carried a particular weight. What it meant in practice was the identification of potential threats, the cultivation of informant networks, and the gradual creation of mechanisms by which civilian populations could be monitored, controlled, and if necessary, punished. This did not happen all at once. It happened in layers, in stages, with each new month bringing a slightly firmer grip around the occupied territories. The Croatian state, that strange and troubling creation that the Germans had helped midwife into existence, presented its own complications. The Ustaše regime was already deeply engaged in what we might call, with careful historical language, ethnic cleansing and religious persecution. The SS found themselves in a position of peculiar leverage. They were not there to restrain the Ustaše, far from it, but rather to ensure that the chaos remained somewhat manageable, that the violence served Axis strategic interests, rather than spiraling into anarchic bloodshed that might destabilize the occupation itself, or so the theory went. The reality was messier, more ambiguous. What drew the SS deeper into direct involvement was not ideology alone, though ideology certainly mattered. It was the emergence of resistance. By late 1941, barely 6 months after the invasion, armed groups were coalescing in the mountain regions. The Chetniks, royalist Serbian nationalists, were operating in the peripheries. Communist partisans were beginning to organize, though still in small numbers. For the German occupation authorities, these were not yet existential threats, but they were complications. They represented the possibility that control might not be as absolute as conquest had suggested. This was the moment when the character of SS involvement began to shift. From liaison and security advising, the institution began to move toward what one might call the militarization of occupation policy. The language in internal documents changed. Where once there had been careful language about administrative order and police functions, there began to appear references to security operations, to anti-partisan sweeps, to what was termed necessary countermeasures. The SS, with its particular ideological commitment to struggle against perceived enemies, positioned itself as the appropriate instrument for this deepening conflict. The recruitment process accelerated during this period as well. The SS High Command in Berlin, working through the regional command structures that had been established in occupied Yugoslavia, began to recognize that German personnel alone could never be sufficient for the scale of occupation being undertaken. The Balkans were vast, the mountainous terrain was difficult, local knowledge was essential, and so, gradually, quietly, the machinery for recruiting local men into SS service began to turn. These would not initially be the formations that would later become notorious. But they represented an important threshold, the moment when the SS began to imagine itself not just as an occupying force, but as the foundation of a new order, one that would require local collaborators and believers. In the cities and larger towns, meanwhile, the SS security apparatus was becoming more visible. Headquarters were established, information offices opened. The apparatus of total control, the registers, the identification systems, the informant networks, began to take shape. A person might be stopped in the street and asked for papers. A neighbor might disappear in the night, questioned about their political sympathies or their ethnic background. These were not yet the organized extermination campaigns that would come later, though they sometimes overlapped with the Ustaše violence already occurring. Rather, they were the infrastructure of fear and control, the administrative machinery that made occupation possible. The gradual militarization of this policy was visible too in the language and organization of the occupation authority itself. Military governance slowly gave way to what might be called SS-dominated security governance. The Wehrmacht remained present, certainly, but the SS began to claim responsibility for what they termed the internal security of the occupied territories. This was framed in the sterile language of administration, but it meant something quite specific: the authority to arrest, interrogate, and eliminate perceived threats, according to criteria that were never made fully transparent to outside observers. What is perhaps most striking, from the quiet remove of historical reflection, is how gradual this transition was. There was no single moment when a decision was made to militarize the occupation, no signed order that can be pointed to and said, "Here, this is where it changed." Rather, it was a series of decisions, small and large, each one building on the one before, each one seeming reasonable within the narrow logic of security concerns and strategic necessity as the occupation authorities understood them. Each step justified the next. Each complication in the situation seemed to demand a more comprehensive response. By the end of 1941, as the first year of occupation drew to a close, the SS had become woven into the very fabric of how the Balkans were being ruled. They were no longer merely advisors or liaison officers. They were becoming, in a real sense, the architects and executors of occupation policy. The resistance movements, still small and uncoordinated, would soon give them reason to expand this role even further. But the foundation had been laid. The machinery was in place. The ideology, the personnel, and the administrative structures had all been positioned for what would come next. In the mountains and forests of occupied Yugoslavia, even as German tanks were still settling into their positions, something was stirring in the shadows. The occupation was meant to be swift, decisive, permanent, but the land itself seemed to resist easy rule. The Balkans had always harbored a fierce independence of spirit, a defiance born from centuries of struggling against empires, and now, faced with Nazi domination, that ancient instinct awakened once more. Two very different movements would emerge to challenge the occupiers, each born from the desperation and anger of the subjugated, yet each pursuing radically different visions of what liberation might mean. These were the Chetniks and the communist partisans, and their rivalry would become as significant to the story of the Balkans as their common struggle against Germany. The Chetniks formed first, almost organically, in the remote regions of Serbia and Bosnia. They took their name from an old tradition. Chetnik bands had roamed these mountains for centuries, guerrilla fighters resisting Ottoman rule, local defenders of Orthodox Christian identity and Serbian nationalism. When occupation came in 1941, surviving Yugoslav army officers, most notably a colonel named Draža Mihailović, began gathering these scattered groups into something resembling a coordinated force. Mihailović was a monarchist at heart, loyal to the Yugoslav king who had fled to exile in London. His vision, at least initially, was not to mount an immediate frontal assault on the occupiers, but rather to conserve strength, preserve the Serbian nation, and wait for the inevitable clash between Germany and the Soviet Union, after which, he believed, the Western Allies would arrive to liberate the Balkans. There was a patient, almost conservative logic to this strategy. Mihailović feared that premature rebellion would bring terrible reprisals upon Serbian civilians, and he may have been right. He understood the cost of resistance in a land where occupiers had shown little restraint. So the Chetniks, in those early months and years, operated as a largely defensive force, controlling certain mountain valleys, protecting Serbian villages from the worst of the occupation, building a network of safe houses and supply lines. They were organized, disciplined, and deeply rooted in Serbian Orthodox culture and Serbian national consciousness. But the Chetniks harbored a troubling complexity, one that would complicate their position as the war progressed. Many Chetnik commanders, particularly in Bosnia, began to see the occupation not merely as a German problem, but as an opportunity to assert Serbian dominance over the region's diverse Muslim and Croat populations. This was, after all, the era of the Ustaše regime's own brutal ethnic campaigns, and in some cases, Chetnik units found themselves drawn into agreements, even collaborations, with German and Italian forces when it served their nationalist interests. It was a morally murky position, one that would haunt the movement and ultimately undermine its credibility with the Western Allies. The communist partisans, by contrast, burst onto the scene with a very different energy. Led by Josip Broz Tito, a half-Croat, half-Slovene revolutionary with decades of experience in the Yugoslav communist underground, the partisans launched their first armed uprising in the summer of 1941, just weeks after the German invasion. Tito's vision was fundamentally different from Mihailović's. He believed in immediate, aggressive resistance to the occupiers, and more profoundly, he believed that the struggle against fascism could become the crucible for a new, multi-ethnic Yugoslavia, one where Serbs, Croats, Slovenes, Muslims, and other peoples would fight together as equals, bound by ideology rather than ancient tribal loyalties. This was, in its way, a revolutionary idea. In a region torn by centuries of ethnic and religious tension, Tito offered a unifying banner. The partisan movement accepted recruits from all backgrounds. Its rank and file included Orthodox Serbs and Bosnian Muslims, urban intellectuals and rural villagers, teenage fighters and seasoned guerrillas. The partisans operated under strict military discipline, with a clear chain of command and rigorous ideological training. They published newspapers, issued declarations, and presented themselves not merely as resistors, but as liberators, as the vanguard of a new social order built on fraternity and equality. In the beginning, the partisans were far smaller in number than the Chetniks, more scattered, less established in the traditional power structures of the mountains and villages. Yet they grew with remarkable speed. Why? Perhaps it was the very boldness of their challenge to the occupiers. Perhaps it was the inclusivity of their message, which appealed to those who had no ethnic or nationalist axe to grind. Or perhaps it was simply that in a time of occupation and suffering, people were drawn to those who promised active resistance rather than patient waiting. The two movements began as potential allies, both claiming to fight fascism, both drawing support from the same traumatized populations. But almost immediately, their fundamentally opposed visions created friction. Chetnik commanders, rooted in Serbian nationalism and monarchist tradition, regarded the communists with deep suspicion. For the partisans, the Chetniks represented precisely the kind of narrow nationalism that had perpetuated the region's divisions and suffering. In mountain valleys and forest hideouts, the rhetoric of cooperation gave way to recrimination, and then to something darker still. By late 1941 and into 1942, skirmishes between Chetnik and partisan units began to occur with increasing frequency. In some areas, they clashed over control of territory and resources. In others, ideological passion ran hot, and violence erupted between former neighbors, even distant relatives, who had chosen different sides. The occupiers watched this internal conflict with a mixture of satisfaction and caution. A divided resistance was easier to suppress than a unified one, but the partisans in particular were proving troublingly difficult to pin down. Here, then, was the tragic paradox of occupied Yugoslavia. The land was rising against its masters, but in rising, it was tearing itself apart. The mountains that had sheltered freedom fighters for centuries were now home to two visions of what freedom might mean, and those visions could not coexist. For the people caught in the middle, the villagers and townspeople who lived under occupation, who feared both the German enforcer and the partisan bands that moved through their lands, this internal struggle added another layer of terror to an already unbearable situation. They did not know from one day to the next whether the armed men who appeared on their doorstep would be seeking food and shelter as allies, or exacting terrible punishment as enemies. The geography of the Balkans, with its steep terrain and countless hiding places, had always made it a difficult land to conquer. But it was proving equally difficult for any single force to control. The Germans and their allies could occupy the cities and major roads, but the mountains remained contested, porous, alive with movement and danger. And within that contested space, two competing visions of Yugoslavia's future were struggling for supremacy, each convinced of its righteousness, each gathering strength from the chaos and desperation of war. The morning light would slip through shuttered windows much as it always had, but the sound that accompanied it was forever changed. In towns and villages across the occupied territories, people woke to an alertness that had become as natural as breathing, a faint tension in the shoulders, a listening quality to silence itself. The occupation was not a dramatic intrusion that announced itself each dawn. Rather, it was woven into the texture of daily existence, present in the small choices and constraints that shaped every hour. In a typical Balkan village, perhaps in Bosnia or Serbia, the day might begin as it had for centuries, with women drawing water from the well, with the smell of bread baking in communal ovens, with children moving toward whatever schooling remained possible under the new regime. And yet everything was watched, measured, understood, through the lens of who held power today. The baker who set out his loaves knew that soldiers might requisition half his day's output. The schoolteacher understood that certain histories could no longer be taught, certain songs no longer sung. The rhythms of work continued, because people must eat and must somehow occupy the hours, but these rhythms were now scored with an undertone of calculation. Curfews reshaped the evenings. In larger towns, movement after dark was forbidden or severely restricted, transforming the night into a void where normal life ceased. People gathered in homes, crowded around tables by candlelight or oil lamp, speaking in lower voices than before, not always from explicit instruction, but from an intuitive understanding that walls had ears and that neighbors could not always be trusted. Some families maintained pre-war routines as a form of quiet resistance, insisting on certain prayers, certain meals, the observance of holidays that the occupation framework sought to minimize or reshape. Others adapted more readily, learning the new languages of administration, the names of local German or Italian officers, the protocols that made survival slightly less precarious. The marketplace, once the social heart of village life, became a site of careful negotiation. Black market activity was widespread and necessary. The official ration allocations were often insufficient to prevent genuine hunger, yet it was also dangerous. Those caught trading in forbidden goods faced penalties ranging from confiscation to arrest. Nonetheless, people did it. A woman might trade carefully hoarded coffee to a sympathetic soldier's girlfriend. A farmer might sell vegetables through underground channels to feed resistance fighters. These acts were small, sometimes born of economic desperation rather than ideological conviction, yet they represented a kind of daily negotiation with the occupation itself, a refusal to accept complete passivity even when active resistance seemed impossible or suicidal. For those in towns with larger German or Italian garrisons, the presence was more immediate and omnipresent. The requisitioning of buildings for military headquarters, barracks, or supply depots meant that soldiers were simply part of the physical landscape. Some local women found work as cleaners or cooks in German facilities, work that was safer and better paid than alternatives, but also morally complicated, marking them as collaborators in the eyes of some segments of the population. Fraternization between occupation troops and local women occurred, sometimes consensual, sometimes coerced, and the resulting pregnancies and mixed-race children would carry the mark of that occupation long after the armies left. Neighbors knew. These things were not forgotten. The young men of the villages faced a particular, acute form of pressure. Conscription into occupation-affiliated forces, whether through coercion or economic desperation, was a constant threat and reality. Some chose to flee into the mountains rather than serve. Others enlisted in hopes of securing survival for their families. Still others were simply taken. The absence of young men from villages, either through flight to resistance movements, conscription into military units, or death, left a demographic hollow that older men and women, the very young, and those too infirm to resist, tried to fill. The ordinary work of agriculture, maintenance, and survival fell to those whose labor capacity had been diminished. The Catholic and Orthodox churches, where they were permitted to function, became spaces of complex negotiation. Religious observance continued, often as an anchor to identity and continuity. Yet clergy navigated a difficult terrain, particularly in regions where the occupation authorities had ideological designs on religious life itself. In some areas, priests quietly provided shelter or information to resistance fighters. In others, they attempted to maintain a careful neutrality, conscious that too much overt resistance would bring retribution on their congregations. The line between preservation and collaboration was often impossible to locate clearly, and people understood this, lived with the moral ambiguity without expecting resolution. Food insecurity was pervasive in many regions, though it varied considerably depending on local resources and how strictly the occupiers enforced requisitions. A village with good farmland and moderate requisition demands might eat adequately, even if monotonously. A town that served as a military hub, where large quantities of provisions were constantly being diverted to feed occupation forces and supply lines, might face genuine hunger. People learned to stretch, bread made from chestnuts or acorns when wheat ran low, thin broths that nonetheless provided some warmth and nourishment. The psychological burden of rationing, the constant mental mathematics of what one could afford to eat, what might be traded or bartered, wore on people in ways that are sometimes difficult to capture in historical accounts. The question of informants was perhaps the most corrosive element of occupied daily life. In every community, it was understood that some people, perhaps motivated by ideology, perhaps by material incentive, perhaps by coercion, were reporting to occupation authorities or to local security forces. The uncertainty about who these informants were, the knowledge that one's casual words in a market or home conversation might be relayed to those in power, created a constant background hum of suspicion. Families became wary of discussing their true feelings or loyalties, even in relatively private settings. Children were sometimes coached not to speak freely, lest they inadvertently betray their parents' sentiments. In many areas, particularly where partisan activity was increasing, the occupation became more visibly militarized as time wore on. Increased checkpoints, more frequent searches of homes, the billeting of larger military units, and the growing reality of armed conflict in nearby areas, these transformed the experience of occupation from an administrative imposition into something more immediately threatening and violent. The sound of distant gunfire, once shocking, became familiar. The sight of wounded soldiers or refugees passing through one's village became routine. The possibility that violence might arrive at one's doorstep shifted from something theoretical to something intimately possible. How did people endure this? In part through the sheer biological and psychological capacity of humans to adapt to circumstance. In part through the maintenance of small, quotidian rituals that preserved a sense of normalcy and agency. A woman might take particular care in preparing a meal, finding in that act a continuity with who she had been before the war. A man might repair his tools with meticulous attention, finding dignity in work done well. Families told stories to children, sang songs when it was safe to do so, marked seasonal changes that had nothing to do with the occupation. These were acts of quiet resistance, though not always consciously framed as such. They were simply the assertion of ordinary human life in the face of extraordinary circumstances. The patience required was immense, and the emotional toll unmeasurable. Anxiety was the baseline state, a low-level, persistent awareness that circumstances could change rapidly, that a neighbor's denunciation or a random sweep could alter one's world overnight. For those harboring resistors, for those helping Jews or others targeted by the regime, this anxiety was acute and constant. For those simply trying to survive, with as little disruption as possible, it was nonetheless present. And beneath the anxiety ran currents of anger, of resentment, of grief for the world that had been lost, for the sons and brothers and friends who had been taken or killed, for the freedom that had been stolen. The occupation was not monolithic, even within a single region. How daily life unfolded depended enormously on local factors, the character of the military commander, the presence or absence of partisan activity, the ethnic and religious composition of the community, pre-war political loyalties, and the particular combination of German, Italian, or local collaborating forces in authority. A village in Italian-controlled zones of the Balkans often experienced occupation differently from one under direct German administration. A Muslim community might navigate the occupation through a different set of calculated compromises and dangers than a Serbian Orthodox or Catholic village. And yet there were commonalities that wove through all these variations: the shared experience of loss of autonomy, the ever-present calculation of risk, the wearing necessity of adaptability, the small acts of maintenance through which people preserved some sense of continuity and selfhood. Daily life under occupation was not heroic for the most part. It was not a dramatic struggle of resistance against evil. It was something more complex and more wearing, the long, grey endurance of people trying to survive, to protect their families, to maintain their humanity in circumstances designed to diminish it. The mountain villages of Bosnia, where minarets rose above stone rooftops beside Orthodox crosses and Catholic spires, would become the unlikely ground for one of the Third Reich's most controversial experiments in multinational recruitment. By late 1942, as partisan activity intensified across the Balkans and German manpower stretched ever thinner across the vast Eastern Front, Berlin began to look toward a population that occupied a peculiar and precarious position in the racial ideology of the Nazi state. The Muslims of Bosnia and Herzegovina, though not Aryans by the strictest interpretations of Nazi doctrine, were nonetheless deemed racially acceptable enough to serve under the swastika, a compromise born not of principle, but of desperate necessity. The formation of what would become the 13th Waffen Division Handschar began quietly, almost modestly, in the spring of 1943. The initial recruitment drive focused on Bosnian Muslims and ethnic Germans scattered throughout the region, Volksdeutsche communities whose ancestors had settled there centuries earlier during Ottoman expansion. The very name chosen for the division carried symbolic weight. Handschar, or Handjar, refers to a curved Ottoman dagger, a deliberate nod toward Islamic tradition, and perhaps an attempt to romanticize the recruitment effort as a bridge between civilizations, rather than the pragmatic military calculation it truly was. The appeal to Bosnian Muslim recruits was constructed carefully, with multiple layers of persuasion. German authorities and their Ustasche collaborators emphasized the protection such service would offer against both communist partisans, whom many Muslims feared as atheistic threats to their faith and community, and the Serb Chetniks, who harbored deep historical hostilities toward Muslim populations. Joining the Handschar was presented as a way to defend one's village, one's family, one's mosque, at a moment when the occupation itself seemed fragile and the future uncertain. For young men facing conscription into less prestigious units, or worse, facing the threat of partisan recruitment, the division offered structure, pay, and the promise of fighting on familiar terrain. There were also more coercive mechanisms at work, though they operated with less visible force than in other recruitment campaigns. The threat was implicit in the occupation itself. Families that cooperated with recruitment efforts received favors and protections. Those who resisted or produced no volunteers might find themselves under suspicion, their movements restricted, their access to resources diminished. The apparatus of occupation created a climate in which volunteering came to seem, in many cases, a rational choice among constrained options. The Volksdeutsche recruitment proceeded along different lines, drawing on ethnic nationalism and long-standing grievances. Ethnic Germans in the Balkans had lived as minorities for generations, maintaining their language, their cultural traditions, and their sense of belonging to a broader German racial community. For the SS, these communities represented a chance to strengthen the ideological purity of their forces, while also addressing legitimate recruitment needs. The Volksdeutsche could be integrated into the division's officer corps and non-commissioned officer ranks, serving as a backbone of German control over the Muslim rank and file. By the summer of 1943, the Handschar division had begun forming in strength, drawing recruits from across Bosnia and from German settlements throughout the region. The initial target was around 10,000 men, though the actual numbers fluctuated and fell short of this goal. Training took place at Neuhammer in Silesia, at a massive camp designed to mold diverse populations into a unified military formation. Think for a moment of the strangeness of this undertaking. Young men from Sarajevo, from mountain villages where Ottoman architecture still dominated the skyline, learning German military protocol, drilling with Wehrmacht weapons, absorbing the ideology of National Socialism alongside the pragmatic instruction in fieldcraft and weapons handling. The barracks at Neuhammer housed an odd amalgam of uniforms and insignia. The Handschar soldiers wore the field grey of the Wehrmacht and the SS runes, but many also wore fezzes, distinctive to Ottoman military tradition, a visual compromise that perhaps best captures the contradictions of the formation itself. Religious services were permitted, and Islamic chaplains were brought in to minister to the troops. This was not tolerance in any meaningful sense, but rather a recognition of practical realities. An army cannot function if its soldiers are alienated from their own spiritual convictions, and the SS, for all its ideological rigidity, remained pragmatic enough to understand this basic truth. The training was intensive and aimed at creating soldiers capable of conducting counterinsurgency operations in their home territory. The assumption was that men fighting in valleys and mountains they knew, against enemies who had murdered their neighbors or threatened their families, would fight with particular ferocity and commitment. There was logic to this, from a purely military perspective, though it ignored or downplayed the moral complexities and the potential for abuse that came with recruiting soldiers to fight in their own backyard. What emerges from the records of this period, such as they exist, is a picture of ambivalence. Not all Bosnian Muslims viewed their recruitment with enthusiasm, even if they participated. Some saw it as the lesser evil among unpleasant alternatives. Others, particularly in younger cohorts influenced by emerging nationalist sentiment, may have viewed it as a legitimate defense of their community and culture. The question of genuine ideology versus coerced participation remains, for many individual soldiers, impossible to answer with certainty. How much did a recruiter from Sarajevo believe in Nazi racial theory, and how much was he simply trying to protect his family and find a path forward in a fractured world? The division's command structure reflected the racial hierarchy of the SS itself. German officers, predominantly career Wehrmacht or SS men, held the senior positions. A number of these men brought with them combat experience from the Eastern Front, hardened soldiers who understood mechanized warfare and ideological fervor in equal measure. The Volksdeutsche served in many middle positions, as platoon leaders and senior non-commissioned officers, while Bosnian Muslim officers were few and generally held limited authority. This arrangement ensured German control while making use of local knowledge and linguistic capability. By autumn of 1943, as the training concluded and the formation approached operational readiness, the Handschar Division numbered around 8,000 troops, somewhat short of the ambitious initial target, but still a formidable force. They returned to the Balkans bearing the insignia of the Waffen-SS, their fezzes and their prayers now integrated into a military formation dedicated to suppressing the partisan insurgency that had grown steadily bolder throughout the region. The human tapestry of the Balkans, its religions, its histories, its competing loyalties, had been woven, however uneasily, into the grey fabric of the Nazi war machine. The camps where the Handschar Division took shape lay scattered across the sprawling landscapes of occupied Europe, and the processes by which men were selected, trained, and transformed into soldiers tell us something profound about the nature of this particular formation. Unlike the purely ethnic German SS units, with their centuries of mythologized lineage, the Handschar drew recruits from populations whose very existence the regime's racial ideology had deemed suspect, even inferior, yet they were needed. The arithmetic of occupation demanded bodies, and ideological purity, it seemed, could be stretched when military necessity required it. The training grounds themselves became spaces of profound contradiction. Men of Bosnian Muslim background, many of whom had grown up under Ottoman and then Austro-Hungarian rule, found themselves in Wehrmacht and SS facilities, learning the language of German military discipline, adopting uniforms that carried symbols whose meanings often remained opaque or deliberately concealed from them. Picture, if you can, the chalk dust of barracks classrooms where drill instructors spoke in German through interpreters, where young men from villages built around mosques and Ottoman architecture learned to respond to commands in a language that carried no resonance with their own cultural memory. The instructors themselves were often ethnic Germans or long-time SS men from Austria and the Reich, men steeped in the pseudo-mystical ideology of the organization. What must it have been like to inhabit both worlds simultaneously, to wear the runes and the insignia of an organization founded on racial doctrines that classified you as racially suspect, while being promised something that looked, on the surface, like belonging? The symbolism sewn into every fabric and emblem of the division carried deliberate contradictions that history has only recently begun to untangle. The Handschar itself, the curved scimitar in the divisional insignia, appeared to honor the Islamic heritage of many recruits, a gesture toward cultural recognition that was simultaneously a profound manipulation. German military leadership, particularly SS recruitment officers operating in Bosnia and Herzegovina, had determined that Islamic imagery and certain carefully selected Islamic leaders could be deployed as tools of loyalty and cohesion. Imams were sometimes brought into camps to offer prayers, to legitimize the formation in the eyes of Muslim recruits. Yet this recognition of Islam existed entirely within the framework of Nazi racial ideology, which had carved out a specific and deeply conditional space for Muslims within its twisted hierarchy. Islam, in Nazi thinking, had certain admirable qualities. It was seen as a warrior religion, disciplined, hierarchical, but only when channeled through German command and German purpose. Internal tensions within the division began manifesting almost from the inception of serious training operations. There were conflicts, some subtle and some not, between the ethnic German officers and non-commissioned officers who commanded the units and the Bosnian and other Balkan recruits who comprised the ranks. Language barriers created gaps through which misunderstanding could seep. Cultural expectations collided, What constituted honor, loyalty, and acceptable conduct differed fundamentally between German military tradition and the more localized social codes of the Balkans. Some officers expressed doubt, in private correspondence that survives today, about the reliability of these foreign troops. Would they fight with the necessary brutality? Would they obey orders when those orders contradicted their own sense of justice or family obligation? Could they be trusted with the most sensitive operations, particularly operations that might bring them into contact with populations that shared their religion or ethnicity? These anxieties were neither baseless nor unique to the Handschar, but they took on particular urgency because of the division's unprecedented composition. By 1943, as the division moved toward operational readiness, there existed within German military and SS circles a genuine uncertainty about how this force would perform. Confidence was not universal. Some SS commanders saw in the Handschar an opportunity to prove that racial ideology could be pragmatically bent when strategic circumstances demanded it. Others viewed the unit with undisguised skepticism, seeing it as a necessary but ultimately expendable experiment. The training curriculum itself merged German military doctrine with a kind of Orientalist exoticism. Recruits learned assault tactics, machine gun operation, and field fortification methods using standard German manuals and equipment, but they also received instruction that played to what their German trainers imagined were their innate strengths: close-quarters combat, mountain warfare, the use of terrain familiar to them. There was something almost theatrical in how German officers sometimes emphasized these supposed national characteristics, as if the Bosnian hills themselves would serve as additional company commanders. In practice, training was demanding and often brutal, no more accommodating to its recruits than any other SS formation would have been. Physical hardship was deliberate policy. Obedience was expected to be absolute. The men endured long marches, weapons drills conducted in all weather, and the psychological pressure that comes from being simultaneously incorporated into a military system and marked as outsiders within that system. By the spring of 1943, the division began its deployment to operational theaters, and here, the contradictions that had simmered in training camps came into sharper focus. The Handschar was sent initially to Bosnia and Herzegovina, to the very regions from which many of its recruits had been drawn. This proximity to home created unexpected complications. Some soldiers encountered relatives caught in the machinery of occupation and resistance. Others discovered that villages they had known in peacetime had become battlegrounds or had been devastated by earlier campaigns. The division's first major operations were ostensibly aimed at suppressing communist and nationalist resistance movements. The partisans and the Chetniks, who were themselves increasingly active in the region. What stands out, as one examines the fragmentary records and testimonies that survive, is the apparent eagerness with which some elements of the division engaged in anti-partisan operations, and the visible reluctance or resistance that other elements displayed. There were units that threw themselves into pursuit operations with an intensity that seemed to exceed what was strictly necessary. There were also instances, carefully documented by resistance movements and later by Allied observers, of soldiers who warned locals of approaching sweeps, who deliberately fired wide of civilian targets, who expressed discomfort with orders that they perceived as unjust. Such resistance was rare, and almost never did it involve outright refusal of orders, but it existed nonetheless. The controversial aspect of the Handschar's deployment lay not primarily in the character of individual soldiers, but in the structure of the operations into which they were placed. The division was, in effect, used as shock troops for some of the occupation's harshest counterinsurgency campaigns. It was deployed into areas where the population was mixed, where Serbs, Muslims, and Croats lived in proximity to one another, where family and clan networks cut across the ideological divides that the war had constructed. To deploy a Muslim unit in these regions was calculated to achieve certain effects. It could intimidate Serbian populations, it could be used to reinforce the propaganda claims of the independent state of Croatia regarding Muslim participation in the new order, and it could also serve to fracture Muslim communities by compelling some into compliance, and creating grounds for resentment among others. Whether these effects were entirely intentional or partly the byproducts of a chaotic occupation strategy remains a question that historians approach with appropriate caution. By the summer of 1943, the Handschar Division had begun to acquire a reputation, both within German military circles and among the populations against which it operated, as a unit of particular severity. The evidence for this reputation is mixed and fragmented, as is so much of the historical record from this period and place. Some accounts from partisan sources and from surviving civilians describe operations conducted by Handschar units with accusations of particular brutality. Other accounts suggest that the division's reputation may have exceeded the reality of its conduct, that propaganda, both from German sources seeking to prove the division's military value and from resistance sources seeking to demonstrate the cruelty of the occupation, inflated the narrative. Still, it remains undeniable that the division participated in operations that inflicted tremendous suffering on civilian populations. Whether that suffering was qualitatively different from the suffering inflicted by other SS units and Wehrmacht formations remains a more difficult question to answer with precision, and one that honest historians acknowledge. By late 1942, the mountains and valleys of occupied Yugoslavia had become a landscape of calculated violence and systematic fear. The German command, growing increasingly frustrated by the tenacity of resistance movements that seemed to multiply rather than diminish, had arrived at a conclusion that would reshape the brutality of occupation policy across the Balkans. They would no longer pursue an insurgency by hunting individuals alone. Instead, they would make an example of entire communities in the hope that terror itself might succeed where conventional military tactics had faltered. This doctrine, collective reprisal, had emerged gradually from the logic of counterinsurgency, though its roots reached deeper into Nazi ideological soil. When a German soldier was killed by a partisan sniper, or when supplies went missing from a supply depot, the response was not proportionate inquiry, but cascading punishment. For every German casualty, dozens of civilians might be executed. For a suspected partisan hiding place, an entire village might be razed. The mathematics of terror had a brutal clarity. If the price of resistance became the destruction of one's own home, perhaps resistance itself would evaporate. The mechanism was chillingly systematic. Local German garrison commanders would receive orders to conduct sweeps through designated areas. SS units, increasingly tasked with these operations, would move into villages at dawn or in the grey hours before darkness fell, when escape routes remained uncertain. They would demand the population assemble in the village square or church. Young men, suspected of partisan sympathies or simply of military age, would be separated from others. Sometimes questioning would follow, often it did not. The selection might depend on denunciations by local collaborators, or it might depend on quota, a number already determined in headquarters that had to be filled, whatever names were attached. The Waffen-SS units conducting these operations often carried out their orders with a precision that transcended ordinary soldiering. They were not conscripts grumbling under duress, but volunteers, many of them ideologically aligned with the racial and martial doctrines of the SS. Their training emphasized obedience to orders and the subordination of mercy to mission. Within the hierarchy of occupation, they occupied a peculiar position, not quite police, not quite military, but something more severe than either. They answered to military command, yet they carried out policies that blurred the line between warfare and systematic persecution. What did this violence look like in lived experience? A widow, in a village near Prijedor, might remember the autumn of 1942 as the season when young men began to disappear. First, there were rumors, whispers of partisan activity in the forests above the village. Then, one morning, German trucks arrived. The soldiers came with lists, or sometimes without them, and selected men almost at random, or following tips from people who harbored grudges. An old conflict over land, a family dispute from peacetime, or simply being the wrong age and the wrong religion, might seal a fate decided in moments. The men would be taken away. Some returned after days of interrogation, others did not return at all. Their names would later appear in lists compiled by survivors or Red Cross workers, the names of the vanished, the presumed dead. The mathematics of collective reprisal meant that the more successful partisan activity became in a region, the more brutal the reprisals grew. This created a grim feedback loop. Partisans would launch attacks, sometimes sophisticated and damaging, sometimes symbolic, but nonetheless provocative. The occupying forces would respond with sweeps that killed civilians. These killings would often drive more young men into the partisan ranks, either out of revenge or out of the cold calculation that the mountains offered better odds than remaining in a village where being young and male had become a death sentence. The insurgency would grow, the reprisals would intensify. The cycle turned upon itself, each rotation bringing deeper trauma and greater numbers of dead. In Bosnia and Herzegovina, where the terrain favored guerrilla warfare and where religious and ethnic divisions added layers of complexity to an already fractured landscape, these operations took on particular savagery. The mountainous geography meant that German control was never complete. A valley might be pacified 1 month and host a partisan assembly the next. This constant uncertainty drove occupation commanders toward escalating violence. If they could not find and destroy the enemy, they would make the population itself bear the cost of harboring them. The year 1942 brought a particularly intensive campaign. German High Command, mindful of the growing strength of both Chetnik and communist partisan forces, ordered major sweeps across multiple regions simultaneously. These operations involved not only SS units but Wehrmacht formations, Ustaše militia, and sometimes even local auxiliary forces recruited or coerced into collaboration. The coordination was imperfect, but the intent was clear: to break resistance through sheer destructive force applied across a wide area with ruthless efficiency. One notable operation, though historians debate exact dates and casualty figures, targeted areas around the Kozara mountain massif, a region that had become a sanctuary for partisan bands and a symbol of resistance. The German command determined that the mountain itself had to be cleared, not just of soldiers, but of the civilian population that might shelter them. Tens of thousands of people were displaced during these sweeps. Villages were burned, agricultural stores were destroyed. The goal was not merely military victory, but the obliteration of the social and material infrastructure that allowed resistance to persist. What was the psychological effect on those living through this? We might imagine, though imagination always falls short of the truth, that fear became a constant presence, not the acute terror of a moment under fire, but the chronic, grinding dread of knowing that safety was conditional and temporary. Parents would hide their eldest sons when news came that German trucks were approaching. Neighbors became potential informers and potential victims. The social bonds that held communities together frayed under the pressure of forced choices: collaborate or perish, flee or be taken, inform or watch loved ones disappear. The doctrine of collective reprisal also produced a kind of moral inversion that occupied much of later historical analysis and memory. When partisans launched operations from villages, they drew German fire and German reprisal onto civilian heads. This was not accidental, but built into the logic of guerrilla warfare, where the separation between combatant and civilian becomes deliberately blurred. The partisans, in their own telling, were liberators. The German occupiers, in theirs, were bringing order and security. The civilians caught between them experienced neither liberation nor order, but only the machinery of violence grinding forward. The historical record grants no innocent parties, only survivors and the dead, and those who lived long enough to bear witness. By the end of 1943, the scale of these operations had produced a region scarred by displacement, reduced harvests, and a population traumatized in ways that would echo for generations. The numbers themselves became almost incomprehensible through repetition. Tens of thousands dead in operations, whose names have blurred into a collective memory of brutality, entire forests of burned villages. The earth itself seemed to absorb the violence, to remember it in ways that human memory might struggle to hold. And yet the resistance grew, seemingly nourished by the very violence meant to destroy it. This paradox, that terror failed to break resistance, and may even have strengthened it, would shape the remaining years of occupation and the liberation that followed. The late summer of 1942 brought a turning point in how the occupation would be waged, and the mountains of northwest Bosnia held the first full expression of what this new phase would mean. The Kozara Plateau rises above the river valleys like a vast, tilted table of stone and forest, its slopes steep and densely wooded, its ridgelines offering sightlines across the entire region. It was here that the SS and their allied forces decided to conduct what they called a Kesselschlacht, an encirclement, a net pulled tight around insurgents they believed to be gathering in the highlands. The operation began in the last days of June 1942, and it would stretch through the summer months with relentless pressure. What began as a military operation against partisan strongholds gradually revealed itself to be something broader and more deliberate. The SS units involved, working alongside the Ustaše, Italian forces, and Home Guard formations, proceeded not simply to engage armed combatants, but to sweep entire valleys and mountain villages, to move through the civilian population with a logic that made little distinction between those suspected of harboring insurgents and those caught simply by proximity and circumstance. The villages scattered across the Kozara's slopes had existed for generations, their stone houses built into the slopes, their fields terraced and worked by the same families season after season. They existed now in a different world, though the fields were still there and the seasons still turned. The people who lived in these places understood, by the summer of 1942, that the war had settled into their lives in ways that could not be dislodged by waiting. What did a Kesselschlacht mean for those who lived in its path? It meant, first, that soldiers moved through with orders to deny shelter and supplies to anyone they identified as partisan. It meant roadblocks at valley entrances, checkpoints that divided families by arbitrary decisions made in moments. It meant that grain stores and livestock were confiscated, not always systematically, but with enough consistency that hunger began to thread through the region. Homes were searched, often roughly, with possessions scattered and sometimes destroyed. Some villages were emptied entirely, their populations gathered and moved to collection points, uncertain of whether they were being relocated, conscripted, or worse. The uncertainty itself was a form of violence, a suspension of the normal sequences of cause and consequence that let people understand their own fates. The Handschar Division and other SS elements conducted these operations with a doctrine that had by now become codified in occupation policy, the principle that collective action against civilians was justified by the presence of insurgents in a region. If partisans operated from a village's mountains, then the village became a legitimate target of reprisal. If supplies were being gathered, those gathering them could be treated as combatants. The line between occupation and terror had always been thin, but in operations like Kozara, it seemed to dissolve entirely, replaced by a logic in which the distinction between civilian and military ceased to hold any protective meaning. How many people were displaced during these months? The records are incomplete and often contradictory, shaped by what various authorities chose to count and how. Estimates suggest that by the end of the operation, somewhere between 30,000 and 60,000 civilians had been moved from their homes, concentrated in camps, forced into labor, or dispersed into regions already strained by occupation and hunger. The camp at Jasenovac, which by 1942 had become a place of systematic killing, received thousands of those displaced. Other camps were used for temporary detention, sorting people into categories of usefulness to the occupiers. Some were released after weeks or months, others were not. The physical endurance demanded of those displaced was severe. The mountain terrain was unforgiving in summer heat, and many of those moved were elderly or children. Food was restricted. Water was sometimes deliberately made difficult to access. Disease moved through gathering places, with the speed of wind through dry grass. Dysentery, typhus, and various respiratory infections found populations already weakened by insufficient nutrition and the psychological weight of displacement. Those who survived would carry the memory of this time as a scar that did not fully close, a rupture in the continuity of their ordinary lives. What happened to homes left empty through the summer? Some were occupied by soldiers or requisitioned for military supplies. Some were damaged or burned, whether deliberately or through the chaos of military movement through inhabited terrain. The stone walls remained, but they held the absence of the people who had built and maintained them. Fields went unharvested. Orchards were picked over by soldiers rather than tended by their owners. The landscape itself became evidence of disruption, a visual record written across the mountainside in burned timber and abandoned boundaries. The partisan forces, too, were affected by these operations, though in a different way. Their supply networks were disrupted. Their ability to recruit among the mountain villages was hampered by the terror induced by the sweeps. Yet there is some evidence, though it must be approached carefully, that the brutality of the Kesselschlacht operations may have actually strengthened support for the partisans in the long term. When occupiers move through a region with violence and displacement, they often inadvertently radicalize those who remain, driving them toward whatever resistance movement offers the possibility of recovery or dignity. Whether this was the case in the Khazara region requires careful reading of the limited testimony available, but the pattern would repeat itself elsewhere in the occupation. Similar operations were conducted throughout 1942 and into 1943, following a similar template, but varying in intensity and scope. The mountains of Serbia saw repeated sweeps. The valleys of Bosnia experienced repeated clearances. The Dinara Plateau, that high, wind-swept border region between Bosnia and Herzegovina, was subjected to operations in which the SS worked alongside Italian and collaborationist forces to push back partisan presence. Each operation was justified in official reports as a necessary measure of security, a response to insurgent activity. Each operation, in its actual unfolding, swept up thousands of people whose relationship to the insurgency was tangential or non-existent, whose crime was primarily to have lived in the wrong place at the wrong time. The psychological dimension of these operations deserves reflection. To live in a village during such a sweep was to experience the occupation not as a distant policy, but as an immediate presence in one's home, in one's family's separation, in the loss of property and autonomy that happened before one's eyes. The trauma of such experience was not abstract, it was concrete, embedded in memory and body, carried forward into the years after the war ended. Survivors of these operations would speak, decades later, of the specific sounds they remembered, the voices of soldiers, the crying of children being separated from parents, the particular weight of holding oneself still in hiding, listening to footsteps in neighboring rooms. The effectiveness of these operations in purely military terms is somewhat disputed. They disrupted partisan operations in specific regions during specific periods, yet they also consumed enormous resources, soldiers, vehicles, supplies, that might have been deployed elsewhere. And they never achieved what they were ostensibly designed to achieve: the complete elimination of insurgent presence. Partisans would scatter and regroup. Supply networks would reform. The mountains offered enough concealment and the support of populations enough complicity that no amount of sweeping could achieve the total control that SS doctrine sought. By the end of 1942, the occupation of the Balkans had settled into a pattern of operation that would characterize the rest of the war: periodic major offensives designed to crush resistance, coupled with continuous small-scale violence and repression, meant to maintain terror and control. The operations like Kozara were the dramatic expressions of this policy, the moments in which occupation policy became visible and violent in concentrated form. But between these major operations, the occupation continued in its ordinary ways: checkpoints, searches, requisitions, arrests, the daily friction between occupier and occupied. The Kozara offensive was not exceptional in its methods or its logic. though the scale of displacement it involved was substantial. It was, instead, a clarification of what the occupation meant when its practitioners were given the space and time to fully express it. In the mountains where the Chetniks moved like ghosts through pine and stone, another force was gathering, one that would prove far more formidable, far more disciplined, and ultimately far more capable of wielding the fractured resistance into something approaching unity. This was the army of Josip Broz Tito, and unlike the royalist fighters who looked backward to a Serbian kingdom that no longer existed, Tito's partisans looked forward to something altogether different, something that transcended the old ethnic and religious boundaries that had for centuries divided the South Slavic peoples. Josip Broz himself was a figure of contradictions, born a peasant in Croatia, trained as a metalworker, a man who had fought in the First World War for Austria-Hungary and been taken prisoner by the Russians, only to return home transformed by communist conviction. He was not purely Serbian, not purely Croatian, not a Muslim, not a priest, and this perhaps was precisely what the moment required. Where Draža Mihailović represented the old Yugoslavia, the kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes, with all its ethnic hierarchies and resentments, Tito represented something that had not yet existed, a unified resistance that transcended nationality entirely. The partisan movement, as it emerged in 1941 and gained coherence through 1942, was structured unlike anything else in the occupied Balkans. The Chetniks, despite their numbers and their decades of tradition, operated as a loose confederation of regional commanders, each answerable to Mihailović in Belgrade, but each also fiercely independent, each commanding his own territory according to his own judgment. The partisans, by contrast, were built on communist organizational principles, a hierarchical chain of command, unified strategy, centralized ideological discipline, and a willingness to subordinate local loyalties to the greater cause. Where might this difference lead? One can only imagine the frustration of Allied officers trying to coordinate with both movements simultaneously, finding in one a bureaucratic maze and in the other an iron chain of command. The early recruiting grounds for Tito's forces were not primarily in Serbia, where Chetnik influence was strongest, but rather in the hills of Bosnia, Croatia, Slovenia, and Macedonia, the very regions where national resentment burned brightest and where the old kingdom's ethnic hierarchies had always felt most oppressive. A Bosnian Muslim, a Macedonian Christian, a Croatian worker, these were the people who heard in communist ideology not a Serbian imperial vision, but a promise of equality, of shared destiny, of a Yugoslavia where all peoples would stand as brothers and sisters in a new social order. It was a seductive vision, particularly when the alternative seemed to be either the fascism of the Axis powers or the nationalism of the pre-war state that had never truly made space for them. By the middle of 1942, the partisans had begun to demonstrate a capacity for coordinated action that the Germans and their allies took with increasing seriousness. Where the Chetniks would raid a supply column or ambush a patrol and then fade into the hills, Tito's forces began to engage in sustained operations, to hold territory temporarily, to administer regions they liberated, however briefly, and to establish what they called liberated areas, zones where a new social order was being practiced in miniature, where people of all nationalities worked together, where women fought alongside men, a radical departure from Balkan tradition. The Germans watched this unfold with growing concern. A disorganized resistance could be contained through terrorism and collective reprisal, but what happened when the resistance became organized, disciplined, and capable of offering its own social vision to a population weary of both occupation and the old ethnic feuds? The appeal of the partisans, it bears noting, was not purely ideological. It was also intensely practical. They offered security to ethnic minorities threatened by Ustaše violence. They offered a path forward for those displaced by war. They offered a sense of purpose in an age of chaos. When a young Croat or Bosnian or Macedonian joined the partisans, he was not simply adopting a political ideology, he was joining a movement that was, at least in theory, protecting him from the violence of nationalist regimes and offering him a role in building something new. This was perhaps the most radical dimension of Tito's appeal, not merely political theory, but lived experience of the multi-ethnic community they were fighting to create. The organizational structure that made all this possible rested on several foundations. First was the party apparatus itself, the Communist Party of Yugoslavia, which, though small and persecuted before the war, maintained a network of cadres who could be activated and deployed. Second was the military hierarchy, which developed through trial and error into something resembling a conventional army, with divisions, brigades, and regiments commanded by officers who had often learned their craft through bitter experience in the mountains. Third, and perhaps most crucial, was the system of political commissars, communist ideologues assigned to every unit to ensure that the struggle remained true to its ideological purpose, to maintain morale, to handle relations with the civilian population. These commissars served as teachers, as judges, as spiritual guides in a sense, binding together fighters who might otherwise have had little in common. By 1943, the partisan movement had swelled to perhaps 50,000 fighters, and it was growing. The Germans, the Italians, the Ustache, all found themselves increasingly unable to contain a resistance that no longer operated as scattered guerrillas, but as a genuine military force. And here is a question worth sitting with as one drifts into deeper sleep. How is it that an ideology born in 19th century industrial Europe, an ideology that seemed fundamentally foreign to the peasant societies of the Balkans, came to be embraced so widely among these mountain peoples? Was it genuine commitment to communist theory, or was it rather that communism offered a practical framework for unity in a time when all the older frameworks had collapsed into blood and ash? The answer, likely, is some complex mixture of both. The communists offered a language through which ancient grievances could be expressed in new ways, through which age-old ethnic tensions could be transcended, through which people who had nothing else in common could imagine themselves building something together. They offered discipline when everything else was chaos. They offered hope when hope seemed impossible. And they offered, crucially, a vision of the future that included not the restoration of the pre-war kingdom with all its injustices, but something genuinely transformed. As the partisan movement grew, so too did its appeal beyond ideology. It became increasingly clear to many people, particularly to younger people and to members of ethnic minorities, that the partisans represented the future in a way that the old Royal Army and the Chetniks did not. The Chetniks looked backward, the partisans looked forward. And in the mountains of wartime Yugoslavia, with the present offering nothing but suffering, the future, however uncertain, however theoretically complicated, held an irresistible attraction. So the movement swelled, month by month, from thousands to tens of thousands, drawing in fighters from every corner of the fractured land. While the mountains of Yugoslavia absorbed wave after wave of occupation and resistance, the perspective from beyond those stone ridges shifted gradually, almost imperceptibly at first, like a compass needle finding a new magnetic pull. In London and Washington, in the rooms where maps were spread across tables and strategy debated late into careful nights, Allied leaders began to ask themselves a question that would reshape the entire calculus of the Balkan campaign. Which of these rival Yugoslav movements could actually deliver results, and which one might prove more useful when the wider war was finally won? In the beginning, the choice seemed simpler. When Yugoslavia fell so quickly in 1941, the Chetniks under Dragoljub Mihailović emerged almost naturally as the face of resistance in Allied eyes. Here was a Serbian officer, a general from the old Yugoslav army, fighting against the Germans with what appeared to be nationalist conviction and monarchist purpose. British intelligence found him first, and by late 1941, liaison officers were being sent to his headquarters in the Serbian mountains. The narrative was tidy. Mihailović represented legitimacy, the continuation of the Yugoslav state in exile, the restoration of the old order. He spoke the language of nation and crown that Western leaders understood. Through the BBC, his reputation was amplified across Europe as a symbol of defiance. Yet on the ground in Yugoslavia, something far more complicated was unfolding, something that took months and years for London and Washington to fully perceive. The Chetniks, for all their anti-German posturing, were not mounting the kind of sustained, organized insurgency that would make a decisive dent in Axis control. They were defensive, cautious, more preoccupied in many cases with preserving Serbian strength for the conflict they feared would come after the Germans left, when, they assumed, they would need to fight the communists. There were moments of ambiguity too, instances where Chetniks collaborated locally with occupiers or focused their violence on Muslim populations and communist rivals rather than on German targets. These were the complications that liaison officers began quietly reporting back to London, though their full weight was slow to register in the corridors of power. Meanwhile, Josip Broz Tito's communist partisans were building something different. Born from the underground networks of the Yugoslav Communist Party, hardened by the brutal discipline of clandestine warfare, the partisans were not waiting for liberation to come from outside. They were fighting now, everywhere, with a strategy that had nothing to do with preserving the old Yugoslavia and everything to do with reshaping it entirely. They recruited across ethnic lines, Serbs, Croats, Muslims, Macedonians, with an ideological message that transcended the ancient tribal divisions that seemed to paralyze other resistance movements. They were organized, they were ruthless, and they were winning adherents daily, particularly among younger people hungry for change and exhausted by occupation. The British, particularly, found this transition difficult to embrace. Churchill himself harbored a reflexive skepticism of communism, yet he also possessed a ruthless pragmatism about warfare. By 1943, reports from British officers embedded with the partisans began painting a picture of an organization that was genuinely threatening Axis control, that was tying down German and Italian forces, that was growing stronger month by month. The mathematics of military necessity began slowly to override the ideological preferences of political leaders. If the question was not whether one liked Tito, but whether Tito's movement could inflict maximum damage on the German war machine, then the calculus shifted. The Americans, approaching the question somewhat later and with different preoccupations, came to similar conclusions through a parallel route. American strategic planners saw the Balkans as a secondary theater, yet they could not ignore the fact that supply lines, intelligence networks, and military efficiency all pointed towards supporting the force that was most effective. By late 1943, American and British intelligence officers were being instructed to shift resources away from Mihailovich's scattered bands and toward Tito's growing apparatus. It was not a decision made quickly or without hesitation, but it was made with the cold logic of military necessity. This shift was not announced publicly with fanfare, nor did it happen uniformly across all theatres and all offices. Rather, it unfolded as a series of quiet reorientations. Supply drops that had gone to Chetniks were redirected to partisans. Liaison officers received new instructions. Radio communications with Tito's headquarters began to carry greater weight in strategic planning. When Churchill sent a new representative to Yugoslavia in mid-1943, the directive was clear: assess whether the partisans were truly the more effective fighting force, and if so, recommend that all British support be consolidated behind them. What made this transition particularly poignant was the element of betrayal that many perceived in it, though whether it was truly betrayal or simply the harsh logic of war depends greatly on perspective. Mihailovich felt abandoned, his struggle rendered invisible by London's reallocation of attention. His supporters saw it as proof of Anglo-American indifference to the fate of those who had fought first and most visibly. Yet from the perspective of those planning the liberation of Europe from German occupation, the question was not sentimental but strategic: which force could most effectively disrupt German operations and liberate the most territory before the Soviet army arrived from the east? This brings us to perhaps the deepest complexity of the Balkan campaign during these middle years of the war: the awareness, growing sharper with each passing month, that the shape of post-war Europe would be determined not by declarations or treaties made in distant capitals, but by which armies controlled which territory when the guns finally fell silent. The Balkans were not merely a military theatre, they were a stage upon which the future would be decided. By supporting the partisans, the Allies were not merely backing a more effective fighting force. They were, perhaps without fully acknowledging it, enabling a communist-led reorganization of Yugoslav society and territory that would persist long after the war ended. Soviet intentions hovered over all of this too, like a storm front gathering on a distant horizon. Stalin was watching the Balkans with interest. The Red Army was advancing steadily westward, and the Soviet leader had his own ideas about what the post-war political arrangements in Eastern Europe should be. Churchill understood this, and it informed his calculations about Yugoslavia. Better perhaps to have Tito establish firm control over Yugoslav territory before the Soviets arrived to impose their own arrangement. Or was there another calculus entirely, one that involved spheres of influence and understandings reached through careful negotiation at conferences like Tehran and later Yalta? The strategic chessboard, in other words, had layers upon layers. There was the immediate question of defeating the Germans and their allies in the Balkans. There was the question of which Yugoslav faction would have the strength to govern when occupation ended. There was the looming question of Soviet influence and intention. And underneath all of it ran the deeper question of what kind of world the Allies were fighting to create, and whether the means by which they fought that war, the alliances they formed, the compromises they made, the forces they empowered, were consonant with the ideals they proclaimed. The mountains of Yugoslavia felt none of this calculation, of course. The villages and towns, the partisans of all factions, and the civilians caught between them knew only the immediate reality of occupation and resistance. Yet every decision made in London and Washington rippled outward to those mountains, affecting which weapons arrived, which regions received aid, which movements were strengthened, and which were left to wither. The great arc of military and political strategy, descending from the highest levels of the Allied command, intersected with the lived experience of people struggling to survive and preserve their communities in one of Europe's most contested regions. As 1944 approached, the die was not quite cast, but it was rolling decisively in Tito's favor. The partisans would receive more substantial material support. They would be recognized, gradually and with some continued American reluctance, as the dominant resistance force. They would be integrated into broader strategic planning for the liberation of the Balkans. And all of this, while militarily sensible and strategically justified, would have profound consequences for how Yugoslavia would be reconstructed, what ideology would predominate, and what relationship that nation would have with the communist world and with the West in the decades to come. But those consequences lay beyond the immediate horizon, still hidden in the fog of war, waiting to reveal themselves in the years after the guns fell silent. Across the pine-covered slopes and limestone ridges of Serbia and Bosnia, a different kind of German military formation was taking shape, one built not from the conscripted masses of the Wehrmacht, but from volunteers, from men who spoke the languages of those lands, who knew the villages and valleys where they would soon be deployed. The 7th SS Volunteer Mountain Division, Prinz Eugen, emerged gradually from 1941 onward, drawing its strength from the substantial ethnic German populations scattered throughout the Balkans, communities that had lived in these regions for centuries, their families rooted deep in the soil, even as their political loyalties remained entangled with the broader Germanic world to the north. These were not men newly arrived from Berlin or Munich. Many had grown up in the towns of the Danube Basin, in the Banat region of southern Hungary, in the Transylvanian hills, in scattered German enclaves across Serbia itself. They spoke Serbian and other local languages alongside German. They understood the customs, the feuds, the careful social mathematics of Balkan villages, and for the Nazi regime, this made them immensely valuable, not merely as soldiers, but as a bridge between the occupation's ideological mission and the complex human terrain it was trying to dominate. The recruitment efforts that filled Prinz Eugen's ranks drew on this intimate knowledge, offering ethnic Germans the prospect of military service under their own flag, within their own linguistic and cultural sphere, in the defense of what Nazi ideology framed as Germanic interests in southeastern Europe. The division itself began with smaller formations and grew substantially after 1942, eventually numbering around 20,000 men at its peak. A considerable portion came from the Banat, from communities that had existed in that region since the medieval period. Others were drawn from across the ethnic German diaspora of the region, from Romania, from Hungary, from areas of occupied Serbia itself. There was also recruitment among local Volksdeutsche, who saw in Waffen-SS service an opportunity for status, for belonging to something larger than their marginal position in the Balkan mosaic. Some joined willingly, persuaded by nationalist sentiment or economic incentive. Others faced subtle or direct pressure, their ethnic identity leveraged to extract compliance. The recruitment process, like so much of the occupation, operated in shades rather than absolutes. The division's operations in Serbia and Bosnia transformed it rapidly from a formation of ethnic volunteers into an instrument of harsh counterinsurgency. By the time Prince Eugen was fully mobilized, the partisan presence in these regions had grown into a serious military threat. The rugged terrain that had once sheltered the Chetniks and the growing partisan movement offered endless opportunities for ambush, for retreat into inaccessible valleys, for the kind of guerrilla warfare that conventional military formations found frustratingly difficult to counter. The response of the occupiers, and of formations like Prince Eugen in particular, was to escalate the violence in ways that sought to break the population's will to resist, or at least to deny the insurgents their base of support. Counterinsurgency doctrine, as practiced across the Balkans during these years, rested on the premise that without local cooperation and supply, the partisans could not survive. This logic led to a brutal calculus. If villages harbored guerrillas or provided them with food and shelter, those villages themselves became legitimate targets. If a partisan unit moved through a region, collective punishment fell on the surrounding population. If supplies were hidden or suspected of being hidden, entire communities might face destruction. This was not the fighting between organized armies that occupiers from the West might have recognized. It was something far more indiscriminate, an occupation policy that increasingly came to rest on terror and the spectacle of violence. The men of Prince Eugen, perhaps because of their linguistic and cultural familiarity with the Balkans, perhaps because of the particular ideological fervor that animated the Waffen-SS, became notorious for the intensity of their anti-partisan operations. They moved through the Serbian and Bosnian highlands in sweeping formations, burning villages, executing suspected guerrillas and their sympathizers, displacing whole populations. The fact that they could communicate directly with local inhabitants, without translators, seemed to deepen rather than temper their brutality. Interrogations could be more psychologically sophisticated, propaganda could be more precisely targeted, and the violence, when it came, carried an additional weight of betrayal. These were, in some cases, men from the same ethnic communities, speaking the same languages, serving the occupiers' cause. The psychological toll on these villages can scarcely be exaggerated. A community might receive a visit from Prince Eugen patrols looking for partisans. The men would spread out through the settlement, checking documents, interrogating elders, searching houses. If weapons were found, or if there was any suggestion of partisan contact, the response could be swift and overwhelming. Houses burned, men and women shot. Sometimes the entire village was razed, its inhabitants killed or scattered into the countryside. The pattern repeated across the landscape, in the Dinaric Alps, in the Serbian uplands, in the river valleys and exposed plateaus where populations tried to maintain some semblance of normal life while caught between the Germans and the insurgents. What made these operations particularly difficult for civilians was their oscillating nature. A village might appear to be secure under German control one day, only to have partisan guerrillas move through it the following night, requisitioning supplies, recruiting fighters, or simply passing through toward their mountain sanctuaries. The next day, Prince Eugen or other occupation forces would arrive, not necessarily knowing whether the villagers had cooperated with the partisans under duress or by choice, whether they had been coerced or willing. The logic of collective punishment made this distinction irrelevant. The village had been compromised. Therefore, the village would be destroyed. The division's actions intensified, particularly after 1943, as the partisan movement grew stronger and the occupation's grip began to feel less secure. Tito's forces were expanding their territorial control, moving from the mountains into more densely populated areas, building an increasingly effective military apparatus. The counterinsurgency response grew more desperate, more indiscriminate, more focused on inflicting maximum casualties and creating zones of such overwhelming violence that civilian populations would be too terrified to offer any assistance to the guerrillas. Prince Eugen participated in these escalating sweeps with a kind of grim, systematic purpose. They were, in many ways, a model unit of what the Waffen-SS aspired to become. Professional soldiers, yes, but also ideologically committed enforcers of the occupation regime's vision of order in southeastern Europe. The division also took on a secondary role in the broader strategy of territorial control. As German forces became increasingly stretched across the region, ethnic German formations like Prince Eugen were deployed not only in active operations, but in garrison duties, in holding key towns and communication routes, in maintaining the apparatus of occupation. This gave them a kind of dual nature, part mobile strike force, part static occupation force, that meant their soldiers experienced both the intensity of combat operations and the grinding, exhausting routine of governing hostile populations. It was in these garrison duties that some of the most notorious incidents of collective violence occurred, when boredom and tension and ideological conviction combined to produce atrocities that served no clear military purpose, that represented simply the exercise of power over the powerless. By the middle of 1944, as the broader military situation deteriorated for Nazi Germany, Prince Eugen would be pulled away from the Balkans toward the borders of the Reich itself, where German forces were desperately trying to hold back the Soviet advance. But the damage it had inflicted on the Serbian and Bosnian populations would remain etched in memory, in the ruins of villages, in the mass graves that would later be discovered and documented, in the survivors' accounts that would eventually form part of the historical record of the occupation. The calculus of occupation, once rendered in the language of security operations and necessary measures, inevitably resolves into something more terrible when examined through the lives it claimed. The Balkans in the years between 1942 and 1944 became a landscape where the logic of counterinsurgency hardened into a doctrine so absolute that entire communities bore the burden of resistance they often did not harbor. In the hills above Sarajevo and across the Serbian plateaus, the pattern established itself with grim regularity. A German patrol attacked, a bridge sabotaged, a supply line disrupted. The response came not as a matter of days but of hours, swift, overwhelming, and indiscriminate. The doctrine was openly stated by commanders, whose names would later feature in post-war tribunals. For every German soldier killed, 100 locals. For every act of resistance, the erasure of villages. It is a mathematics of terror, one that historians do not recount lightly, and listeners deserve the truth of it, without embellishment, yet without flinching. The region around Kozara, in northwestern Bosnia, witnessed one of the most systematic sweeps of this period. In the summer of 1942, the SS Prince Eugen Division, together with Wehrmacht units and Ustaše auxiliaries, launched an operation intended to crush partisan activity in the region. What unfolded was not a military campaign in any conventional sense, but rather a vast exercise in forced displacement and elimination. Tens of thousands of civilians, women, children, the elderly, were driven from their villages into ravines and detention camps. The precise numbers remain contested by historians, though conservative estimates place the casualties in the thousands. Many who survived the initial sweep perished later in camps from disease, starvation, and systematic abuse. The operation accomplished its stated military objective. Partisan activity in Kazara diminished sharply afterward. The cost, however, was the destruction of communities that had existed for centuries. What must be understood is that these were not spontaneous eruptions of violence, but rather policies conceived in advance, transmitted through orders, and implemented with bureaucratic precision. The SS units operating in the Balkans were not disconnected from the central authority of Berlin. They functioned as an extension of it, interpreting broader directives into local actions. When senior SS commanders in the region received instructions to pacify territories through maximum force, those instructions traveled down a chain of command that included officers, NCOs, and enlisted men who understood exactly what was being asked of them. A small village might disappear almost silently from the historical record. Gradak, Podgora, Mrkonjić these and countless others were systematically burned, their populations either killed where they stood or deported to camps where their fates would be swallowed by the machinery of occupation. Some villages were suspected of harboring partisans, others stood in the path of SS operations and offered what passive resistance they could. Still others had the misfortune of being inhabited by Serbs during a period when the Ustaše regime, working alongside German authorities, was conducting campaigns that approached genocide. The distinction between military necessity and atrocity blurred so thoroughly that it became meaningless. What does it mean to walk through such ground today? In Bosnia and Serbia, there are memorials that mark where villages stood, simple monuments bearing names and dates that return those lost to a kind of existence, remembered if not recovered. Srebrenica's memorial, though it commemorates a later tragedy, embodies a principle that extends backward through the war, that names matter, that bearers of names mattered, and that forgetting is a second death. The partisans, as they drove northward and liberated territory, kept careful records of atrocities. Photographs were taken, witness accounts collected. These documents would later form the foundation of post-war prosecutions, though justice, then as always, proved incomplete and uneven. The SS men who carried out these orders were neither faceless automatons nor universally enthusiastic ideologues. Evidence suggests a spectrum of participation and motivation among them, some driven by ideology, some by the momentum of military culture, others simply following commands in an environment where refusal carried risks. Yet understanding motivation does not diminish responsibility. Each order executed, each village entered with torch and rifle, each family separated and relocated into darkness, represented choices made by individuals who could have resisted in ways both dramatic and subtle. That most did not resist raises questions about human nature and institutional pressure that resist easy resolution and linger still. The testimony of survivors, recorded in the decades following liberation, speaks of a specific quality to the fear that permeated these communities. It was not the ordinary fear of war, but rather a peculiar dread, born of knowing that one's entire family could be erased because of geography or ethnicity or the accidents of proximity. An old woman might recall hiding in a forest for 3 days while her village burned, listening to sounds that she could not quite place and hoped never to identify. A boy separated from his parents at a checkpoint would describe the uncertainty, the not knowing, as more painful sometimes than the loss itself, because hope persisted alongside grief, an exhausting and finally unbearable tension. In the archives of the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, established decades later, testimony fills thousands of hours. Survivors sit across from the names of those who gave orders, the names of those who pulled triggers, the names of those who maintained the machinery. Some cases conclude with guilty verdicts, others end in acquittals or dismissals on technicalities. The law attempts to impose order on what was fundamentally chaotic and dehumanizing, which is perhaps why the law so often seems inadequate to the task. Consider that nearly every massacre site in the Balkans now bears a marker of some kind. These are not triumphal monuments, but rather quiet places where the landscape has been changed to serve memory. Stone and plaque replace what was lost. Words acknowledge what cannot be restored. The weight of occupation policy, one might reflect, consists not in grand pronouncements but in these small presences, in the necessity that arose after the war to name what had been taken, to say that it had mattered, to refuse the erasure that violence initially sought to achieve. As night settles across those same karst mountains, where church bells once rang in villages that no longer exist, the silence itself becomes a kind of testimony. The occupation is long finished, the SS units dispersed into history, the perpetrators aged or gone. Yet the absence remains geographically real, marked by memorial stones, and the persistence of those who survive to remember, and to insist that such things not be forgotten. By the autumn of 1944, the maps on German headquarters walls had begun to tell a story of contraction rather than expansion. The vast territorial holdings that had seemed so permanent, so meticulously organized through occupation bureaucracies and garrison deployments, were now subject to the implacable pressure of forces moving from multiple directions at once. The Soviet Red Army, having turned the tide at Stalingrad and methodically pushed westward through Ukraine and Moldavia, was drawing closer to the Balkans with each passing week, and this proximity alone altered the calculus of what remained possible for German commanders in the region. The withdrawal began not with retreat, but with a recognition that the occupied Balkans could no longer be defended as a rear area, as a zone of relative security and resource extraction. Supply lines that had stretched from Germany through Austria and into the occupied territories grew more precarious. The Luftwaffe's capacity to protect these routes from Allied aircraft grew thinner still. What had been a question of occupation management became a question of survival and strategic positioning. The partisan forces, meanwhile, had grown into something that neither the Wehrmacht nor the Waffen-SS had initially anticipated or adequately prepared for. They were no longer scattered guerrillas, scattered across mountains and forests, but a genuine army with command structure, supply chains, and territorial ambitions of their own. Josip Broz Tito's movement had achieved what seemed almost miraculous in its scope. The communist partisans had managed to recruit and organize across ethnic boundaries in ways that the Serbian Chetniks, despite their earlier prominence and their ties to the Yugoslav government in exile, had failed to accomplish. The partisans offered not merely resistance, but a vision of something after resistance, a Yugoslavia reconstituted on different ideological lines. They had attracted Serbs, Croats, Slovenes, and others who might have been considered unlikely allies, united by the promise of national liberation and the demonstrated competence of partisan organization. By 1944, they controlled significant portions of Bosnia, Croatia, and Serbia, and they held the initiative in ways that required increasingly desperate German responses. The Soviet thrust into the Balkans began in earnest in the late summer of 1944. The Red Army's entry into Romania in August and their subsequent movement toward Yugoslavia and Hungary created a strategic imperative that transcended all other considerations. The Germans could not hold everything. They could not simultaneously maintain occupation control, resist Soviet armies, and contain partisan insurgency. Choices had to be made, and those choices meant that some positions would have to be abandoned. Some forces would have to be withdrawn northward, toward Austria and Hungary, where the defensive line might still be held. The Waffen-SS divisions operating in the Balkans found themselves caught between contradictory orders: maintain occupation control, prepare for withdrawal, conduct anti-partisan operations, hold territory against Soviet advance, protect ethnic German populations. The mathematics of it was impossible. The 7th SS Volunteer Mountain Division, Prinz Eugen, which had grown accustomed to operating as an occupying force with relative freedom of action in Serbia and Bosnia, found itself increasingly committed to rearguard operations. These were not the sustained garrison duties and anti-partisan sweeps of previous years, but rather constant movement, engagement with partisan forces that had become increasingly bold and organized, and the management of retreat logistics while maintaining some semblance of operational capability. The division had been blooded in the mountains and valleys of the Balkans for years now, its personnel familiar with the terrain in ways that newly arrived German units were not. This familiarity now became a burden as much as an asset, because it meant they were often held in place longer, expected to delay partisan advances, while other formations fell back. In September of 1944, as Soviet forces crossed the Danube and threatened Hungary, and as the partisans intensified their offensives in Bosnia and Serbia, German command made the decision that had perhaps been inevitable for months. The Balkans could not be held. The territories that had been occupied, exploited and controlled for 3 years would have to be evacuated. This decision, once made, created a cascading series of military operations aimed at maintaining order and preventing complete collapse as German and affiliated forces withdrew northward. The retreat was not a simple, orderly withdrawal. It was a process complicated by the presence of thousands of ethnic German settlers who had to be evacuated, by collaboration regimes like the independent state of Croatia, whose viability depended on German military presence, by vast quantities of supplies and equipment that either had to be transported or destroyed to prevent them falling into partisan hands, and by the need to maintain enough military force in the region long enough to cover the retreat itself. Imagine the logistical mathematics of such an operation. Thousands of vehicles, hundreds of thousands of personnel from various German and SS units, Croatian militia, Volksdeutsche armed formations, all attempting to move north through territory increasingly controlled by partisan forces or threatened by Soviet armies approaching from the east. The 13th Waffen Division Handschar, the Bosnian Muslim SS division that had become so controversial and so compromised in its deployment and its conduct, found itself in particularly difficult circumstances. This formation, which had been raised with considerable ideological investment and which had suffered significant casualties and morale problems during its operations in Bosnia, was now tasked with covering retreat routes and protecting the evacuation of Croatian and Bosnian Muslim collaborators who had cast their lot with the Germans and whose fate under partisan rule seemed likely to be execution. What had been a counterinsurgency force was now becoming an evacuation escort and a rearguard. The moral dimensions of this transformation, if we pause to consider them quietly, were substantial. These men had been recruited partly on the promise of fighting communism and partisans, partly on the basis of religious and ethnic identity, and now found themselves engaged in one of the war's bleaker exercises, facilitating escape for people who might otherwise face retribution. The retreat unfolded across the latter months of 1944 with a kind of grim determination. German forces conducted fighting withdrawals from position to position. The partisans pressed forward with increasing confidence, taking territory that the Germans were abandoning, but at the cost of casualties that mounted with each engagement. The Red Army's advance from the north added urgency to the process. Soviet forces entering Hungary and pushing toward Vienna meant that German resources had to be concentrated on holding a northern defensive line, which in turn meant that less could be spared for defending the Balkans or covering the retreat. In Serbia, the political landscape shifted dramatically. Belgrade itself had been an occupied city for over 3 years, administered under German military authority, its population subject to constant surveillance and periodic violence. As Soviet armies approached the city in October 1944, German garrison forces withdrew. The vacuum they left was filled by partisan units, and Belgrade's liberation became less an event of Western Allied forces arriving to overthrow tyranny, and more a moment of Soviet-aligned forces taking possession. The partisans entered the city as representatives of a unified resistance movement that had triumphed over both German occupation and internal rivals. Consider what this meant for the shape of post-war Yugoslavia. The country's liberation was not orchestrated from London or Washington, but achieved by forces whose allegiance lay toward Moscow. The retreat of SS and Wehrmacht forces from Serbia and into Bosnia created a compression effect. German formations that had been dispersed across a vast occupied territory were now concentrated in narrower spaces, moving north through Croatia and Bosnia toward Austria. This concentration, paradoxically, sometimes made them more capable of conducting defensive operations, but it also meant that any partisan breakthrough threatened to trap or cut off entire formations. Supply lines became critical vulnerabilities. The roads northward, already damaged by air assault and partisan activity, became choke points where vehicles and troops accumulated, vulnerable to air attack and ambush. The weather turned. Autumn in the Balkans, particularly in the highlands, brings cold and rain that can turn mountain roads into treacherous routes. The retreat, therefore, had to maintain speed despite these conditions. Vehicles broke down. Infantry columns moved on foot. The formations that had once occupied every significant town and village now moved in compressed groups, protecting their vulnerable elements, the supply trains, the evacuees, the wounded, with combat troops that were themselves increasingly depleted by casualties, illness, and exhaustion. By the winter of 1944 and early 1945, most German and Waffen-SS formations had withdrawn from the Balkans entirely. The 7th SS Volunteer Mountain Division, Prinz Eugen, fought its way through Bosnia and Croatia, leaving behind destroyed villages and burned bridges as it moved north. The 13th Waffen Division Handschar, having suffered enormous casualties and facing complete dissolution, was fragmented and evacuated in sections. SS personnel, who had operated in administrative, security, and command positions throughout the Balkans, were reassigned or withdrawn. The machinery of occupation was being dismantled and moved northward, leaving behind a landscape transformed by war and now being claimed by forces that represented a different vision of the post-war world. What remained in the Balkans, as German and SS forces departed, was a partisan movement triumphant but exhausted, controlling territory but facing the enormous challenge of consolidation and governance. Soviet forces were present or advancing. Ethnic tensions that occupation had suppressed or exacerbated now erupted without German administrative authority to contain them. The international community, the governments in exile, the Western Allies, the Soviet Union, had competing visions for what should happen next. But those calculations belonged to the negotiating tables and the diplomatic channels. On the ground, in the villages and towns and mountain valleys of the Balkans, what mattered was that the foreign soldiers were leaving, that the occupation was ending, and that what came next remained utterly uncertain. The human cost of this unraveling phase was substantial, though often less visible in the historical record than the great battles and massacres. People died in rearguard actions. Civilians caught between retreating German forces and advancing partisans faced violence from both sides. Those who had collaborated with the occupation faced retribution or escape attempts. Ethnic Germans were evacuated from territories where they had lived for generations. Collaborationist regimes collapsed. The independent state of Croatia, already on the verge of dissolution, dissolved entirely as German military support evaporated. The Ustaše leadership fled, some to Austria, some seeking to negotiate surrender with the Western Allies, most eventually facing capture or death. The retreat, therefore, was not merely a military operation, it was a rupture in the occupational order that had governed the Balkans for 3 years. With that rupture came liberation, but also uncertainty, possibility, but also violence, the end of one chapter and the beginning of another whose shape could not yet be clearly discerned. As the autumn of 1944 descended upon the Balkans, the momentum that had carried German and SS forces through years of occupation began to shift beneath their feet. The Soviet advance from the north was no longer a distant rumor, but a tangible pressure, and within Yugoslavia itself, Tito's partisans had grown from scattered bands of resistance fighters into a formidable military force that could no longer be contained by police actions and reprisals alone. The careful calculation of occupation, the balance between terror and control, between just enough force to maintain authority and not so much as to provoke irreversible insurgency, began to collapse. Belgrade, the heart of Yugoslavia, had endured 4 years of German rule. The capital city, with its Austro-Hungarian architecture still bearing the marks of previous empires, had become a center of collaboration and resistance both, a place where German officers moved through cafes and parks, where the Gestapo maintained its headquarters, where local police and auxiliaries answered to both Axis administrators and, increasingly, to whispered orders from the underground. The city's population had learned to live in the peculiar tension of occupation, the suppression of public gathering, the curfews, the constant awareness that informants moved among neighbors, that a careless word could lead to arrest or worse. By late September 1944, as Soviet forces pushed closer and German defenses crumbled, the decision was made to evacuate Belgrade. It was not a sudden panic, but a recognition that the territory could no longer be held, that the great supply lines running south from Germany were becoming untenable, that to remain was to risk encirclement. The withdrawal began methodically, with German military units preparing to move southward, destroying infrastructure as they went, bridges, warehouses, communication systems, in the manner of armies retreating through land they no longer expected to reclaim. For the civilians of Belgrade, the liberation that followed brought feelings that moved in many directions at once. There was relief, certainly. The immediate threat of bombardment and street fighting was lessening. The arbitrary violence of occupation, the roundups, the searches, the summary executions, would soon become memory. And yet there was also profound uncertainty. The partisans who entered the city were victorious but armed, disciplined but driven by their own vision of what Yugoslavia should become. The future was not yet written, and many feared what would be written upon it. The final days of German occupation in Belgrade were marked by something that historians have described as a strange, muted quality. There was no climactic battle within the city itself, no symbolic confrontation of armies in the streets. Instead, there was movement, the sound of trucks and columns heading south, the removal of documents and equipment, the disappearance of uniforms from the streets as German personnel departed. Some witnesses spoke later of a peculiar silence, as if the city itself was holding its breath, uncertain whether to celebrate or mourn. When partisan forces entered Belgrade, the streets slowly filled with people emerging from their homes. There were flags brought out from hiding places, flags of Yugoslavia, flags that had been illegal to display for 4 years. There were tears, yes, and embraces, and the tentative joy of people who had survived an ordeal they had not chosen. And there was also the weight of everything that had happened, the people who did not emerge to see liberation, whose absence was felt as acutely as a physical ache. The human cost of occupation and liberation is not easily tallied in moments. Numbers exist, of course. Historians have worked carefully through archives and testimony to document the deaths, the executions carried out by the SS and German military, the Ustashe killings, the partisan casualties, the civilians who died in bombardments or from starvation or disease. In the region as a whole, perhaps 1 million people had died during the war years, about 10% of Yugoslavia's pre-war population. The Balkans had become a landscape of profound suffering, and Belgrade's liberation did not erase that suffering, but rather marked the moment when it began to be quantified, measured, acknowledged in the daylight. For those who had lost family members, liberation brought not simple joy, but the beginning of grief. Many had not known the fates of missing relatives for months or years. Some would spend weeks and months searching through lists of the dead, through refugee camps, through the growing monument to loss that the war had created. A woman might learn that her husband had been executed in 1942. A child might discover that siblings had not survived. These discoveries came not all at once but in waves, as information was gathered and shared, as the networks of communication that war had severed began to knit themselves together again, slowly and imperfectly. The broader liberation of the Balkans moved forward in the weeks that followed Belgrade's fall. Partisan forces, now fighting in alliance with Soviet troops, pushed south and eastward, driving German and SS units before them. The Prinz-Eugen Division, that brutal force that had conducted counterinsurgency operations in the mountains, found itself retreating through terrain it had once dominated, now harried by partisans who knew every ravine and pass. The withdrawal was neither swift nor orderly. It was a prolonged unraveling, a grinding retreat that took weeks to play out across the vast geography of the Balkans. In the countryside, in the villages and small towns that dotted the landscape, liberation took on a different character than it did in Belgrade. These places had endured perhaps even more acute suffering than the capital. They had been the sites of anti-partisan sweeps, of collective reprisals, of villages that had been burned because they were suspected of harboring partisan sympathizers. Some communities had lost half their population or more. When liberation came, it came not to cities with cafes and infrastructure, but to places where the basic structures of civilized life had been shattered. The partisans arrived as liberators, yes, but they were also often seen with a complicated mixture of emotions: gratitude intermingled with fear, recognition of the courage they had shown in the mountains, mixed with awareness that their revolutionary vision might transform society in ways both hoped for and dreaded. The process of counting the dead, of understanding the scope of loss, would occupy Yugoslavia for years and decades after the war itself ended. There were mass graves to be found and excavated, testimonies to be collected, monuments to be planned and built. But in those first weeks of liberation, the immediate work was more practical: the restoration of basic services, the distribution of food to populations that had been stretched thin by years of occupation, the attempt to bring some order to chaos. And beneath these practical concerns, there moved the undercurrent of human experience: the reunions of families separated by war, the joy of people who believed they had survived an apocalypse, the sorrow of those who had not. On the evening of liberation in Belgrade, in those first days of October 1944, as the autumn light faded over the Danube, people moved through the streets, in a state that was neither quite celebration nor quite mourning, but something that contained both. The war was not over. Fighting would continue elsewhere, and German forces would not fully surrender for another 7 months. But in this place, occupation had ended. The immediate oppression had lifted. What would come next, no one yet knew. But for a moment, people could simply exist without the constant weight of foreign military authority. That freedom, however uncertain its duration, was a kind of homecoming, even for those who knew that home itself had been fundamentally altered, that the Yugoslavia that emerged from this war would be something different from what had existed before. When the guns fell silent across the Balkans in the spring of 1945, an immense and troubling question settled over the landscape, like dust after an avalanche. How does a people reckon with what they have endured and what they have done to one another? The mountains that had sheltered partisan units and harbored resistance now stood witness to a nation attempting to remember without fracturing, to judge without endless cycles of revenge, to forge a future from the charred remains of occupation and civil conflict. The immediate aftermath brought trials, though they unfolded differently than in other parts of Europe. In Yugoslavia, under Josip Broz Tito's emerging authority, the process of accounting for collaboration and war crimes was bound up inextricably with the necessity of nation-building. The regime faced a paradox that has seldom been fully resolved: how to punish those who had served the Waffen-SS and their allies, while simultaneously binding together a multi-ethnic state that had been torn apart by ethnic violence and competing ideologies. The Yugoslavian authorities pursued high-profile prosecutions in the immediate post-war years. Members of the Ustaše regime faced trial. Officials and officers were convicted and executed. Some of the most prominent figures of the independent state of Croatia were captured, judged by Yugoslavian courts, and sentenced to death. This process, though incomplete by any measure, established at least a formal acknowledgement that what had transpired was crime rather than political difference. Yet a vast apparatus of collaboration remained largely unexamined. Thousands who had worn the uniform of the Waffen-SS divisions, recruited from Balkan territories, the Handschar, the Prince Eugen, the smaller units and militia formations, vanished into a fog of amnesty, flight, or administrative forgetting. Some disappeared into displaced persons camps. Others were absorbed into the apparatus of Tito's new state, their pasts overlooked in the urgency of rebuilding. The question of memory itself became politically charged almost immediately. In the immediate post-war period, Tito's regime promoted a particular narrative of the war, the triumph of the partisan movement as a unified, multi-ethnic liberation force, the heroism of resistance, and a kind of official reconciliation that spoke of shared Yugoslav suffering and shared Yugoslav victory. This narrative, which contained considerable truth, also served to minimize or obscure the deeper communal violence that had ravaged the region. The massacres perpetrated by the Ustaše against Serbs, the complex and sometimes brutal history of Serbian Chetnik collaboration with occupiers, the local vendettas, and ethnic cleansings that had unfolded beneath the larger ideological conflict, these were often subsumed into a grander historical memory. Monuments and memorials became the physical language through which this memory was constructed. Across the Balkans, memorials rose to partisan fighters and resistance martyrs. These were often monumental in scale and style, abstract or brutalist in form, reflecting a modernist aesthetic that seemed to reach toward a universal rather than particular memory. Stone sculptures and plaques marked partisan supply routes, commemorated battles, and honored those who had died in the struggle. These monuments, built with official sanction and state resources, created a landscape of memory that was itself contested. For some, they represented genuine heroism. For others, they seemed to occlude the more complex and painful history of collaboration, of victims who were not partisan soldiers, of neighbors who had turned against neighbors. The mechanisms of justice were also selective, in ways that reflected both practical necessity and deliberate political choice. War crimes trials continued sporadically through the late 1940s and into the 1950s, but their intensity gradually diminished. The Cold War and Yugoslavia's geopolitical position meant that some individuals who had collaborated with the Germans were viewed as potentially useful against Soviet influence, and thus were quietly spared prosecution. Former German officers, including some with Waffen-SS backgrounds, passed through Yugoslav territories and were occasionally tolerated or allowed to depart. The complexity of sorting out who had done what, and under what degree of duress or choice, often led to pragmatic decisions that were never fully aired in public reckoning. In villages and towns where occupation and resistance had played out most immediately, memory took on a more intimate and sometimes more contradictory character. Families had been divided. Some members had joined partisan units, while others had served the occupation or remained neutral. Neighbors had informed on neighbors. The Waffen-SS recruitment drives, particularly in areas with significant Muslim or ethnic German populations, had created situations where young men faced terrible choices: conscription, flight, or joining units that promised status or protection. After the war, survivors had to live alongside one another in communities that were simultaneously healing and struggling with profound wounds. One of the most poignant aspects of post-war reconciliation in Yugoslavia was the gradual emergence of what might be called a shared memory of suffering. Across ethnic lines, Serb, Croat, Bosnian Muslim, Slovene, there was recognition that the Balkans had endured occupation, that resistance had been widespread and often costly, and that the common enemy had been Nazi Germany and its allies. This unified memory, which became central to Tito's Yugoslav identity, had genuine power. It created a basis for coexistence and permitted multi-ethnic communities to function. Yet it also, by necessity or design, obscured important details about who had done what to whom and why. Consider the case of the 13th Waffen Division Handschar, the unit composed largely of Bosnian Muslims. After the war, those who had survived faced complex social positions. Some were welcomed back to their communities as conscripts who had been forced into service. Others were viewed with suspicion or hostility as collaborators. The distinction between coercion and choice was often impossible to draw with precision, and communities had to negotiate these murky territories without clear guidance. The moral questions about how much agency these recruits had possessed, about whether fighting for Germany was categorically different from fighting for other powers, about how to judge actions taken under threat, were rarely debated publicly. Instead, they simmered beneath the surface of post-war life. The Soviet Union's role in the liberation of the Balkans and the subsequent Soviet influence over Yugoslavia in the immediate post-war years meant that war crimes testimony and investigation were sometimes shaped by Cold War considerations rather than pure historical accuracy. Crimes were documented, but documentation could be selective. Trials were held, but not always with the rigor that full historical accounting might demand. The focus on Soviet participation in liberation sometimes eclipsed other aspects of the resistance story or emphasized interpretations that served Soviet interests. Over the following decades, as Yugoslavia developed its particular form of socialism and as the Cold War deepened, the post-war reckoning evolved in ways that were distinctive. There was no Yugoslav equivalent to the Nuremberg trials, no grand, internationally televised accounting. Instead, there was a kind of negotiated amnesia, maintained by state power and reinforced through official narrative. Former partisans occupied positions of authority in the new state, and their version of the war became, in many respects, the official version. This had both positive and troubling consequences. It maintained stability. It allowed multi-ethnic coexistence to take root. It focused attention on the future rather than endless recrimination about the past. Yet it also meant that many questions remained unexamined, many victims unacknowledged, many complexities of collaboration and resistance unstudied and unmourned. What emerged in Yugoslavia was a model of post-war memory that was, perhaps of necessity, partial and politically instrumentalized. It was not the same as denial, and it was not the same as comprehensive justice. It was rather a careful balance, maintained through official narrative, through state-controlled memory institutions, and through the pragmatic decisions of communities trying to rebuild themselves. The landscape itself became the keeper of this memory. Monuments standing in village squares, mass burial sites known by locals but not always marked, stories told within families but not always to outsiders. The fragility of this arrangement would become apparent only much later, as Yugoslavia itself began to unravel in the 1990s. The careful equilibrium that Tito's regime had maintained, the unified Yugoslav memory of shared resistance and shared suffering, would prove insufficient to contain the historical resentments and ethnic tensions that had never been fully resolved. The post-war reckoning of the 1940s and 1950s, constrained as it was by political necessity and pragmatic choices, would resurface as an unfinished business when the Cold War ended and Yugoslavia dissolved. But in the immediate post-war decades, across the mountains and valleys of the Balkans, that reckoning represented a tentative, imperfect, yet deeply human attempt to move forward from one of history's darker chapters. The stone villages of the Balkans, so much of their landscape scarred and reshaped by the years of occupation and conflict, have slowly, over the decades that followed, begun to settle into a different kind of quietude, not the silence of fear or the hush of forced submission, but the slow, patient quiet that comes when a place begins to remember itself. The new roofs built over old foundations, the roads repaired and widened, the young trees planted where forests once burned, these are not erasures, but rather a form of gradual healing that seems almost natural, almost inevitable, in the way that wounds close and scars fade into the texture of skin. When you walk through those landscapes today, through the pine-scented valleys, and along the ancient trade routes that wind between mountains, you encounter something perhaps unexpected. The physical reminders of those years are present, yes, the pockmarks of gunfire on some walls, the carefully maintained memorials in town squares and village centers, the names carved into stone that serve as anchors for memory. But they exist alongside the evidence of ordinary life resumed, of children playing in streets, of markets reopening with seasonal abundance, of families gathering around tables much as they might have done 1,000 years before the war came. The landscape does not forget, but it learns to hold both the sorrow and the continuity in a kind of balance. The question of how a place, a people, processes such recent and intimate trauma is one that historians and survivors have grappled with quietly, often in conversations that take place late in the evening or in the soft daylight of late autumn. The Balkans chose, in many ways, to build forward rather than backward. The memorials erected in the years after 1945, the plaques affixed to buildings, the sculptures installed in parks, the small stone markers placed at the sites where villages once stood before they were burned, these became a form of conversation between the past and the present. Not a conversation that speaks in anger, but in a voice that insists, "This happened here, you walked these streets, you knew these names, do not forget." There is something profoundly moving about the way that names persist. In the archives and in the memory books that were carefully compiled, often by surviving relatives or by historians who came later, the individual names of those who were killed, displaced, or who fought in the resistance have been documented with an almost spiritual care. A man named Petar Markovic, a woman named Maria Petrov, a boy whose name was never fully recorded but whose family was remembered. These names, spoken aloud or read silently, become a kind of presence. They refuse to dissolve into abstraction. They insist on their own specificity, their own irreducible human particularity. The passage of time, now nearly 80 years since the war ended, has transformed how the Balkans relates to this history. The immediate aftermath, from 1945 through the early 1950s, was a period of intense reckoning, of trials conducted with varying degrees of justice and fairness, of attempts to assign responsibility and establish truth. Some of those trials were thorough and principled, others were opaque, conducted in the shadows of Cold War politics, where allegiances shifted, and some perpetrators found themselves valuable precisely because of their wartime knowledge or their usefulness to the emerging geopolitical order. The records of these proceedings, many of them now open to scholars, reveal the extraordinary difficulty of establishing justice in the immediate aftermath of such devastation. How do you assign individual responsibility when entire systems were complicit? How do you weigh confessions offered under duress, or testimony given with decades of trauma and grief still fresh in the voice? What seems clear, from the perspective of these many years later, is that the Balkans gradually developed its own way of holding this history, not the way of forgetting, and not quite the way of unending vendetta, but something more nuanced. The monuments and memorials serve as waypoints, as places where people can acknowledge what was lost and what was endured. In the town of Srebrenica, in eastern Bosnia, there is a memorial complex where thousands of white marble headstones catch the light in a way that is almost otherworldly. Each one marks a burial, a name, a date of death. When you stand among them, you are standing in the presence of a scale of loss that resists easy comprehension, yet the space itself somehow facilitates a kind of quiet acknowledgement that the individual deaths, accumulated into this terrible aggregate, matter immensely. The forests themselves seem to remember. In many regions of the Balkans, the woods that were burned during anti-partisan operations have regrown, and they are denser and more vibrant than before, as if the land is determined to reclaim what was taken. The birch trees that colonize burned areas grow quickly, their white bark seeming almost luminous in certain light, and within a generation or two they are succeeded by the slower-growing oaks and conifers that would have dominated the original forest. It is a process of succession that unfolds according to ecological principles indifferent to human history, and yet there is something almost hopeful in watching it. The land heals, time does its work, not by erasing, but by transformation. Oral memory, too, has proven to be a form of resistance against forgetting. The grandmothers of the Balkans, in particular, became the keepers of stories that might otherwise have been lost to archives and official histories. In kitchens and on benches outside village homes, they told the stories of where their families had hidden, of the taste of the bread they baked during the worst shortages, of the names of neighbors who were never seen again. These conversations, recorded by historians and oral history projects, and passed on to younger generations within families, created a kind of distributed archive of memory. Not authoritative in the academic sense, perhaps, but alive in a way that documents sometimes are not. A story told by someone who lived through it carries within it a texture of truth that is different from, though not necessarily superior to, the rigor of historical scholarship. There is a particular poignancy to the way that certain places have become pilgrimage sites of sorts for descendants of the diaspora. The children and grandchildren of those who fled during the war and never returned have, in recent decades, begun to make journeys back to the villages and towns where their families originated. They come to see the landscape that shaped their grandparents' imagination, to walk the streets that their relatives described in letters written in exile, to touch the stone walls of houses that might or might not still be standing. These journeys are often quiet, sometimes tinged with sadness, and sometimes charged with a more complex emotional electricity, a sense of homecoming tangled with displacement, of recognition mixed with alienation. The Balkans of today is not the Balkans of 1941 or 1944. And yet, the land itself, the mountains, the rivers, the ancient trading routes, remains continuous, a kind of physical anchor to a history that cannot be fully retrieved, but also cannot be escaped. The question of reconciliation, too, has haunted the Balkans in ways both obvious and subtle. Unlike some other regions that experienced similar devastation and occupation, the Balkans did not experience a wholesale geographic separation of populations that might have made the work of moving forward more administratively straightforward. Croats, Serbs, Muslims, Roma, Jews, these peoples had shared villages and towns for centuries. The occupation and the resistance divided them, sometimes violently, but it did not entirely relocate them. In the decades after the war, and especially in the period after the breakup of Yugoslavia in the early 1990s, the Balkans was forced to confront the question of how neighbors, who had killed each other, could live alongside each other again. There are no simple answers to this question, and honesty requires acknowledging that the success has been partial and uneven. Yet in many communities, a kind of pragmatic coexistence has emerged, built on the recognition that the alternative, continued enmity, serves no one. The memorials themselves have become more thoughtful over time. The early monuments, erected in the immediate post-war period, tended toward grand scale and clearer ideological messaging, statues of resistance fighters, inscriptions celebrating nationalist causes, monuments designed to commemorate victories. In more recent years, some communities have supplemented these with more ambiguous, more psychologically complex memorials, spaces that acknowledge loss without simplifying its sources, artworks that resist triumphalism and insist instead on the complexity of what occurred. A memorial in one Bosnian town, for instance, consists simply of a row of water fountains inscribed with the names of people who died, their water running continuously as a kind of quiet insistence on the persistence of life. These newer memorials seem designed for contemplation rather than for the reinforcement of group identity or national narrative. There is something deeply human in the way that places accumulate meaning over time. The Balkans of today is layered with multiple pasts, not just the Nazi occupation, but also the Ottoman occupation that preceded it, and the Austro-Hungarian period before that, and the medieval kingdoms and empires that existed before modern nation-states reshaped the region's identity. The occupation during the Second World War is one more chapter, profound and searing in its immediacy and its cost, but not the only story the landscape has to tell. This layering of time, this accumulation of strata, seems to create a kind of wisdom, a recognition that empires rise and fall, that ideologies come and go, that violence transforms landscape and people but does